the people of Manila threw themselves a victory parade. About 5,000 Filipinos took part in the celebration of the people power movement that swept Ferdinand Marcos from office. Meanwhile, former political prisoners, some of the group of 36 released Thursday, held a news conference today.
We are very happy about our release.
Getting back in, Marcos' opponents who'd fled the country. Among the first to return, former Foreign Secretary Raul Manglapes.
I was saying before I was rudely interrupted by Ferdinand Marcos, we are going to be the greatest democracy in the world.
Manglapes met later with President Aquino, who aides said today plans to serve her 6-year term and then go back to being
the mayor has refused that. So while political prisoners are being freed in the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos and 89 family and friends remain prisoners of their own protection. Reed Galen, NBC News, Oahu.
We have 2 reports, beginning with Jim Laurie in Manila.
Yet one more celebration on the 3rd day of Aquino's presidency. A march by several thousand carrying the signs of freedom and liberation. Freedom for political prisoners. Aquino has now ordered all remaining detainees be released soon, including communists. Freedom for exiles. The first of many in exile since 1972 are being welcomed home.
And as I was saying before I was rudely interrupted by Ferdinand Marcos, we are going to be the greatest democracy in the world.
The problems left by Marcos will be with the new regime for some time. Orders have now gone out to move against the financial assets of Marcos and his friends.
Our work pertains to all accumulations of ill-gotten wealth, here in the Philippines or abroad.
A roundup of some properties has already begun, including the confiscation of these 12 vehicles, among them 6 Mercedes-Benz found at the home of one of Marcos' nephews. Crates of money, some $6 million worth, believed headed for Marcos family members, have been impounded. Searches of cars, homes, and offices have been carried out. Private planes have been grounded, and departing Filipinos on commercial flights are being checked closely. The need to round up the Marcos fortune, estimated at more than $3 billion, is underscored by the plight of the poor here. These Manila slum dwellers are staking out plots to live on government land. The squatters trying to keep Aquino to a campaign promise to give land to the poor.
We are hoping that our president, Mrs. Cory Aquino, will give this land for these people, for us.
The kind of hopes here that in the long run, Aquino may find hard to sustain. Jim Laurie, ABC News, Manila.
This is John McWethy in Washington. With Marcos and his party still at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, the Reagan administration today changed its position on what to do with the millions of dollars in currency and valuables that Marcos brought with him from the Philippines. Yesterday, only American law was considered relevant. Today, the U.S. government says that Philippine and international law will also be considered before Marcos and his party can claim all of their baggage. President Reagan was asked what the U.S. planned to do with the valuables.
Again, I think that there's no way for us to know anything about this. This is up to the government of the Philippines.
U.S. officials say there are 2 reasons for the change. 1, the amount of valuables found on the 2 planes was far more than anticipated. And 2, the Philippine government is pressing for return of all Marcos assets in the U.S. A group of lawyers has been retained by the Philippines to press for that end.
Over the last 20 years, Mr. Marcos has looted the country to the tune of $5 to $6 billion.
The Reagan administration still wants to provide Marcos with a dignified way to fade from public view, but officials now realize that's going to be extremely difficult. John McWethy, ABC News, the State Department.
Freed. Mrs. Aquino's military advisors warned against freeing communists, but said they would obey her order. The events that shook the Philippines continue today to be celebrated in Manila. But as NBC's Gary Cutley reports now, whether this can be turned into real change is one of the biggest problems for Corazon Aquino.
It was a victory parade today through Manila's business district, and the middle class was out in force. While the euphoria continued, Mrs. Aquino was on the verge of claiming that she heads a revolutionary government. That may be the only way for her to handle the levers of power in Parliament and the courts, which are packed with Marcos people. At the Supreme Court, there was a demonstration as lawyers demanded that the justices, headed by a Marcos schoolmate, step down. Since there is no legal way to force that, the pro-Aquino lawyers are building their case.
We may be operating not under the Constitution, but precisely we are operating extra out of the Constitution, since this seems to be, from all appearances, a revolutionary government.
But at the Canlubang sugar plantation today, there was no sign of revolution. The wealthy family which owns it shows how even the elite is divided. One branch of the family supported Marcos and gave him this land for a country retreat. But another branch backs Corazon Aquino.
Right now, she's riding on a wave of goodwill. Now, how long she'll be able to sustain this largely depends on how she's able to start the process of change.
But there are some powerful people who may not want much change. Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile met with Special Envoy Philip Habib today. Enrile is one of the richest men in the Philippines, and he was one of the most powerful when he was martial law administrator under Marcos. What happened here in the Philippines this week was not an ideological revolution. It was a powerful, urban, middle-class rebellion against a fraternity brother who went too far for too long. Now Marcos is gone, and Mrs. Aquino will have to show whether she really can change things. Garrick Utley, NBC News in Manila.
Reports that former President Marcos brought a plane load of riches with him into exile continue to stir controversy today. NBC News has been told that Marcos got out with more than $1 million in pesos, gold bullion, jewelry, and titles to land holdings. A State Department official told NBC's Ann Garrels all of this is a profound embarrassment, and the administration may impound part of the loot. And when President Reagan was questioned about all of this today, he finished with an expletive that appeared to be directed at reporters. The questioning began during a photo op, a chance to take pictures of the president, and he plainly didn't want to talk about the reports of Marcos and his money.
There's no way for us to know anything about this. This is up to the government of the Philippines and the people of the Philippines.
Then, as reporters were being ushered out of the meeting, the president offered a final phrase.
Sons of bitches.
Later, when Mr. Reagan was leaving for Camp David, he tried to brush off the incident.
I thought it was one of you saying it about us.
And the president's press spokesman, Larry Speaks, said Mr. Reagan didn't recall saying that. But then Speaks added, if he said anything, he said, it's sunny and you're rich.
The 8-year-old former president said his family, which arrived here 2 days ago, plans to stay in Hawaii and will rent or lease a home as soon as possible. Bill Redeker, CBS News, Honolulu.
And leave his country because he did not want any bloodshed. Bill Stoller reports.
Ferdinand Marcos and his wife Imelda have been secluded in their quarters since their arrival in Hawaii 2 days ago. Earlier today, they appeared at what was called a media availability at the Hickam Air Force Base Officers Club. The ground rules were firm, no questions. He explained his flight from the Philippines.
When I left Malacanang Palace, I decided to move to the northern part of the country, Lawag City, in the province of Ilocos Norte, my home province. However, shortly after arriving at Clark Air Force Base by helicopter, I was informed by President Reagan's direct representative that we would have to leave for Guam instead, and not Lawag.
And he spoke of his options before leaving.
Although I had control of superior military power and several opportunities to employ this military power, the employment of such an overwhelming force, no matter how legitimate, would have resulted in the bloody carnage among innocent civilians.
After his reading, when questions started, Marcos and his wife took a reluctant leave. Bill Stoller, ABC News.
Philippines changed. It was brought about by a woman who was a reluctant candidate for the presidency of the nation, a reluctant challenger to one of the longest ruling dictators of modern times. The events of this week mean the long nightmare of the Filipino people is over. Here's a look back at how it happened.
I admit that I have no experience in cheating, stealing, lying, or assassinating political opponents.
I've never seen such a dirty campaign, and I don't think she will win anyway.
Marcos, alis dyan! Marcos, alis dyan! But if you insist in using violence, then violence it is!
I am counting on a landslide to offset any cheating that Marcos will do.
We're concerned about the violence there and the possibility of fraud, although it could have been that all of that was occurring on both sides.
Proclaim Ferdinand E. Marcos as the duly elected president.
And if Goliath refuses to yield, we shall keep dipping into our arsenal of nonviolence.
I think this regime is about to crumble. With respect to the military, we are in control of probably 98 to 99%. I am president, so why should I step down?
I, Corazon Cojuangco Aquino, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully.
The long agony is over. We are finally free. It is a glorious feeling that we have finally regained our democracy, and the most beautiful part is that we did it through peaceful and nonviolent means.
And that's the National Edition. I'm Jan Tennant. Good night from all of us at Global News.
Topple governments. Sometimes they succeed. Good evening. I'm Charles Gibson, and this is Nightline. Can people power really make the difference? Philippine President Marcos tonight said he didn't want to shed Filipino blood.
Although I had control, employment of such an overwhelming force would have resulted in the bloody carnage among innocent civilians.
We'll focus on that story, plus we'll go live to Sweden for the latest on tonight's assassination of Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme.
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Charles Gibson.
Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, who is best known for his pacifist beliefs, was killed tonight, gunned down on a Stockholm street. Palme liked to boast that he could walk around Stockholm without bodyguards. He was alone with his wife tonight. They had just walked out of a movie when a man stepped forward and shot him twice at close range. Palme had been Prime Minister from 1969 to 76. He then regained power in Sweden in 1982. He was best known for his vehement opposition to American involvement in Vietnam. He once compared the U.S. bombing raids over North Vietnam to Nazi atrocities. But with equal vehemence, he spoke out against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Above all, Palme abhorred the arms race.
I think that both superpowers understand that this arms race is making them more and more unsafe, and that they will never be able to unleash this nuclear war without annihilating humankind as we know it.
The UN Secretary General, Perez de Cuellar, tonight said Palme's contribution to international peace would be his lasting legacy. Why was he killed? Not much is known about that. Standing by with us live in Stockholm is Lars Christensen, who writes for Stockholm the first time since leaving his country. He made a short statement, he took no questions, and thus he left unanswered most of the questions about his actions in his last days as Philippine president.
President and Mrs. Ferdinand Marcos.
The U.S. government and the Air Force had an almost regal-looking setting for him to meet the press, with reporters well back behind ropes. Marcos referred to the days of last weekend and early this week as a period of confusion. And he said Mrs. Aquino and her supporters were moving against him by force.
This created the need to decide whether to eliminate them with military force or negotiate. This situation came to a point that although I had control of superior military power and several opportunities to employ this military power, the employment of such an overwhelming force, no matter how legitimate, would have resulted in the bloody carnage among innocent civilians. And so knowing I could lose everything if I did not use military power, I chose, however, to use my authority over such military power to protect the Filipino people instead.
It is widely known Marcos told American officials he wanted to stay in the Philippines. Tonight, he said, when he left Manila, he still thought he could stay in the Philippines.
When I left Malacanang Palace, I decided to move to the northern part of the country, Lawag City, in the province of Ilocos Norte, my home province. However, shortly after arriving at Clark Air Force Base by helicopter, I was informed by President Reagan's direct representative that we would have to leave for Guam instead.
Now, said Marcos, he is looking for private quarters to rent or lease, and he will leave Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii as soon as such arrangements are made. Marcos' son says his father wants to stay in Hawaii, but fears he might not be safe there. Marcos tonight said nothing about the reported millions of dollars in cash, jewelry, and securities that he brought with him out of the country. Marcos claimed he had superior military force. That is debatable. But he certainly did not have a force that some consider greater, people power. And we'll look at that in a moment. 3 weeks ago today, it was Haiti, and many other countries come to mind where similar events have taken place. Despite the presence of powerful, well-organized, and well-equipped military forces, veteran political leaders faced with unarmed civilians demonstrating in their streets have chosen often to throw in the towel and flee. How and why does it happen? Here's Nightline correspondent Jed Duval.
How is it that a person comes to the point of going into the street to confront a tank? People without weapons, without particular organization, no ranks or files. How do they face an army? Because they have each other. Because it is not a man or a woman, but the people themselves with their anger and impatience that say to each of them, I'd rather be here in front of this tank than take any more of so-and-so. When there is not enough resolve among the sergeants and lieutenants and colonels to rev the tanks and run over the people, then it becomes clear to so-and-so that it is time to depart. In Haiti, substitute for tanks, Tonton Makut. Substitute dancing in the streets for sitting in them. Same show. So-and-so can't control the crowds, can't shoot them. Time to find the airport and go. The people in Iran came to hate the Shah, their so-and-so. They faced one of the world's best equipped armies. The people won in the streets. Something runs through a crowd. Something says, now's the time. Leave home, leave work, leave school, and get down to the plaza and raise hell. How many join merely for the excitement? Remember, the tanks don't always lose.
On November 4th, Soviet tank divisions rumbled into Hungary across the Romanian border. They methodically began to slaughter the freedom fighters by the thousands.
These pictures are from Hungary in 1956. And these are from South Africa in 1985. In some places, in lots of places, substitute dogs and hoses for tanks. Still, something has pushed the people. Some chant, some slogan, a song. The people are stirred, and out they come into the streets, into the park, expecting not to die, but indeed to live. Indeed.
I'm a great believer in
in mass democracy, in the sense I don't think massive people can be led to do things that they don't want to do.
Michael Kazin teaches history at American University in Washington, D.C.
There is a certain amount of rationality going on, I think, in people's minds. That is that, you know, they aren't just a mob. They're a thinking mob, if you will.
Nobody believed that we could demonstrate to the world that we can bring down a dictator with absolute powers through nonviolence. And we were able to do it. And for this, I think we have given an example to the world.
Resistance like that, people power, what Corey Aquino calls people power, really begins 10, 20, 30 years before the actual event. Anonymous people doing anonymous acts in communities, in churches, putting out little pamphlets, talking about how we can overthrow this dictator.
What a wonderful party it becomes. Flags to wave, songs to sing, the people triumphant. But what happens when the party is over? There was happiness in Managua after Somoza was thrown out, but the promise of freedom is unfulfilled in Nicaragua. In Iran, too, the excitement of revolution after the Shah was deposed has turned to the glum gray of a tightly controlled dictatorship.
In the end, despite technology, despite armies, despite even nuclear weapons, there are people behind those weapons, there are people in those armies, and it can take a long time, and the outcome cannot be what many Americans might like sometimes, but nevertheless, people will rule.
Yes, there is people power. Mass, even in confusion and excitement, they can have their way. But after the victory, there is more to do. There is no guarantee of permanence. When this bunch of rebels, radical colonists, had chased the British, they sat down to make a new government. Benjamin Franklin was asked by a Mrs. Powell, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" Came the reply, "A republic, if you can keep it." Jed Duval for Nightline from Washington.
When we come back, people power and the problems of keeping the people's goals on track. We'll talk with a former U.S. diplomat who served in a number of countries that have seen revolutionary change. With us now live in our New York studios, William Sullivan, former U.S. ambassador to the Philippines and to Iran, where he was posted at the time the Shah was deposed. And also in New York, Maynard Parker, editor of Newsweek, former Newsweek bureau chief in Hong Kong, from where he covered events in Vietnam, India, China, and the Philippines. He also directed Newsweek's coverage of the Iran crisis. Ambassador Sullivan, are we naive a little bit when we talk about people power? Do these things happen in the streets, or are there forces behind the scenes that we don't see that really are the determinants?
I think by and large in the Philippines, what you saw was what there was. The people power that you call it was catalyzed, of course, by the actions of Defense Minister Enrile and Acting Chief of Staff Ramos. But the fact was that Cardinal Sin was able very rapidly to bring together those people who had gone immediately into the churches late that night on a Friday night, and to suggest to them that their duty took them out in the streets and to form a human cordon around Camp Aguinaldo and Camp Crame. Now, those were actions that I doubt were organized in advance, but they were the spontaneous reactions of people to a circumstance that presented an opportunity for them.
All right, you point to the influence of the church. Maynard Parker, does there have to be an organized force in a country to make change like this occur?
Well, it certainly helps a great deal. It certainly was the moral suasion of the Catholic Church, along with the tremendous growth of Mrs. Aquino during this process, really going from housewife to moral and then a political leader. But it was the Catholic Church behind her. Likewise, in Iran, you had the militant Islamic clergy behind that revolution. So in both of those instances, one Muslim and one Catholic, you did have a powerful clergy behind a political figure. And in the case of Iran, a number of the political figures were, of course, members of the clergy themselves.
So people sit down in the streets in the Philippines and the tanks turn back. Obviously, in our lifetimes, we have seen examples where people sit down in the streets in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and the tanks don't turn back. Are there factors, really, I guess I'm asking, that you can look for in countries that point to the fact this is going to be successful, or in this country it will not be? Maynard?
Well, I think it really depends on whether the military and the political leadership behind that military has the nerve and the loyalty of their troops. There's no question anywhere along the borders of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the Soviets, if push comes to shove, are prepared to use force to keep the Eastern European countries under their control. Likewise, I think up to this point, you have seen the same thing happen in South Africa, where the white Afrikaner government is willing to use force, and the police force and the army of that country is willing to follow the orders and shoot, if necessary, people. The point, at the moment that in South Africa begins to waver, the army begins to doubt the wisdom of the course they've been asked to do by their political leadership, then it seems to me the black leadership in the streets will begin to have probably more success than they have had to date in South Africa.
Ambassador Sullivan?
Well, certainly in the two instances with which I'm familiar, Iran and the Philippines, I think Maynard put his finger on it. It was not so much a question of the unwillingness of the Shah to call upon his troops to try to disperse the mobs, but rather his conviction that if he did make that call, the young people behind the guns would not pull the triggers on their brothers and their fathers and their sisters. And I sat many hours with him while he worried this question. He also, of course, did have some sense of conscience, as I think President Marcos has indicated tonight, that he was reluctant to have his own troops shoot his own people.
And the question, of course, exists there as to whether or not he had the control of the forces and they would have followed it had he given that order to shed blood.
Well, my immediate reaction when I was waked up on last Saturday morning then said that, told that Johnny Enrile and Eddie Ramos were in the Defense Ministry at Camp Aguinaldo was that I hoped they had the Air Force on their side, because in that first half hour or so they were enormously vulnerable to an airstrike, and apparently they did have some knowledge that the Air Force was neutralized and would not strike them.
And in those first hours, it had to happen in those first hours.
If it didn't happen in those first hours, then they were running against the proposition of being required to shoot into the bodies of innocent, unarmed people.
One other thing that is worth pointing out in the difference between Iran and the Philippines is that the U.S. government spoke with one voice in the case of the Philippines in urging Marcos to leave and to be replaced by a moderate opposition. In Iran, you had a situation where the State Department was doing one thing and telling the Shah one thing, and the National Security Council advisor was telling him another. So I think it's important in moving and helping people power along that the U.S. policy and how that is implemented and told to the leader in question is also examined.
All right, let me take a break here, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit about how you keep these changes on track, how people power, in effect, follows through. And we'll get to that when we continue our discussion in a moment. Quickly, the rebel or the revolutionary has to turn to being a governor. What role does the people power play in that, and how long can the people really be supportive of a new government, and when does that wear off and the new government, in effect, is on its own?
Well, it obviously will wear off after a certain amount of time. You're seeing in India with Rajiv Gandhi at the beginning of the last few weeks to wear off. But I think Mrs. Aquino has a tremendous amount going for her. First of all, unlike some of these other countries we've been talking about tonight, it isn't really a real revolution in the Philippines. What you've got is the same middle-class leadership that has ruled the Philippines since independence, now continuing to run the country. Mrs. Aquino, in effect, will take over in a situation much like the one that prevailed before martial law was declared in the early 1970s. She's grown tremendously as a leader. She's proven to be very tough and providing a moral example to her leadership. She is now, I think, being a conciliator at a time when that's necessary. I think she's tough enough, however, to keep the people behind her and, if necessary, do the very tough things that may be necessary in the future.
All right, Ambassador Sullivan, the last 15 seconds, yours.
Well, in Iran, of course, the way in which that revolution was consolidated was very ruthless. The Ayatollah and his people, first of all, eliminated the left-wing opposition, and then they eliminated the moderates, and eventually they took control, but always continuing to use people as the source of their power. They operate through the mosques to control mobs in the streets to enforce their power whenever they want to do it. As Maynard said, Mrs. Aquino is going to have to deal with a system that is far more geared toward a conventional form of government. She's going to have to work at getting, for example, all the provincial governors and mayors out of her offices.
All right, thank you both very much for joining us tonight. I appreciate your being with us. That is our report for tonight. I'm Charles Gibson in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
KVCT Victoria. TV3 Wilmington, North Carolina.
WLOS, Asheville, Greenville,
KATU, Channel 2,
We've been watching station call letters from all across the country, including your local station, an ABC affiliate. Our ability to bring you national and local programming is the cornerstone of the network television system, helping to make you the best entertained and informed audience in the world.
This has been Nightline. Nightline is a presentation of ABC News.
The Catholic Church played a large role in bringing position of power last week in the Philippines. So were the rest of the Philippine people. Our review of the week's news begins with them.
We are finally free, and we can be truly proud of the unprecedented way we achieved our freedom, with courage and with determination, and most important, in peace.
Corazon Aquino said it was people power that made Ferdinand Marcos relinquish his despotic power. By the thousands, people turned out in Manila to encircle and protect the camps where two of Marcos's top military men started a mutiny last weekend. Defense Minister Juan Enrile and Deputy Chief of Staff General Fidel Ramos said Marcos stole the recent presidential election from Mrs. Aquino, and they could no longer support it.
This is a small matter of which we have control of.
From his palace, Marcos vowed to hold out until the end.
I'll get back my sniper rifle, which I wanted to employ just in case it was necessary to protect my family.
The biggest battle of the week was for control of the airwaves. Aquino forces attacked Channel 4, the government television station. Marcos was on the air, and then, suddenly, he wasn't.
Any of the propaganda lies without...
Once more, thousands gathered outside to prevent Marcos' forces from regaining control.
Channel 4 is on the air again to serve the people.
A few hours later, Marcos was back on another channel, but the incident exposed to the whole country how his power was slipping. The next day, Tuesday, was Inauguration Day, and for a while there, Filipinos had two presidents. Mrs. Aquino was sworn in by her supporters, while at the presidential palace, Marcos was sworn in. Prophetically, somebody pulled the plug on that broadcast, too.
He was hanging on. He was looking for a life preserver.
Senator Paul Laxalt received a call from Marcos at 3 a.m. Manila time. Laxalt's a friend of both Marcos and President Reagan. He said he gave Marcos advice.
I think that you should cut, make it a clean cut, and move on.
Marcos left that day on a U.S. military plane. With 90 friends and family members and another plane full of luggage, Marcos arrived in Hawaii and went into seclusion at Hickam Air Force Base. Mrs. Aquino selected her cabinet. She said she would not move into Marcos's palace.
I would like to lead by example, and in these very difficult times, it is not fitting for the leader of an impoverished nation to live in extravagance.
It was a historic wonder to see shabby knaves who murdered and cheated their countrymen of the precious vote were swept aside by people who rose up in an act of self-determination inspired by the most basic human stuff: weeping, cheering, praying, singing, and a sheer yearning for democracy. It was a lyrical piece of writing in this morning's New York Times by Francis X. Kleins. What has happened in the Philippines inspires lyricism to people who love freedom. We have John Sheehan on the line from Manila right now. That must have been something to see today, John.
It really was. As far as you could see, just people.
More than 1 million of them, we've been told, hailing Corazon Aquino's first public appearance since she became president of the Philippines. And it was also a mass, was it?
Yes, the Mass is very significant because the Catholic Church has been heavily involved in this change of government. And the Mass was celebrated by Jaime Cardinal Sin, who will be going on Tuesday to report to Pope John Paul II.
Now, she said she's restoring various political rights that were suspended by Ferdinand Marcos, John. But what's especially interesting is this release of political prisoners. Is Corazon Aquino really going to release them all, even the leaders of the communist insurgency?
It's gone both ways so far, and this is Corazon Aquino's first test in her own government, just how much voice she has as against some of her advisors and maybe against the wishes of the United States. She said they are all going to be released. Now they've held back on at least 4 who are associated with the Communist Party. We still don't know whether they are going to be released.
Well, one of the guerrillas who was freed last week, Victor Corpus, said that now he thinks the guerrillas will come down out of the mountains. There's no longer anything to fight for. Their victory has been won by the people at large. Is there a chance that the insurgency really will be over now?
Mrs. Aquino has an interesting line of reasoning on that. She says that President Marcos's decree that people could be thrown into jail without trial is what drove them into the hills and encouraged them, since they had no possibility anymore of opposing the government vocally in the society within the rules, they turned to the gun. Maybe we'll see that she was right.
Well, now that the Filipinos have accomplished what they set out to do, I mean, is Mrs. Aquino's party a party without a cause? I mean, they've come to power. There's still very serious problems ahead, which everybody's sort of overlooking in the excitement of the present moment. Isn't that so?
Well, Mrs. Aquino's party is not really the Unido party. Mrs. Aquino's party is people power, just those huge masses you saw in the pictures from Manila today. And she's trying to redirect people power to help her govern. She is encouraging people to stay in touch with the government, to report things that are wrong, to report the needs of the people. There are plenty of needs of the people. There is bone-crushing poverty in this country. At the same time, not too far from here, people power is being used in a different way. There are demonstrators laying siege to the Supreme Court, backing up Mrs. Aquino's demand that the Supreme Court step down. There are demonstrators in another neighborhood laying siege to a mayor's office where the people don't want to lose the mayor that the Aquino government is replacing. So for the first time, people power is also being used against her.
Yeah. Boy, these are going to be an interesting few weeks, aren't they, John? The ones that follow, to see if Mrs. Aquino really has the skill to govern.
She has terrific problems ahead of her. This government was born into a constitutional crisis. This was at once a proof of democracy, and it was outside democracy. It wasn't by the Constitution that this government came to power. And one of the reasons that people are calling on the Supreme Court to step down is because the Supreme Court is the one body in this country that might still declare the Aquino government illegitimate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I envy your being there. And
over 1 million people crowded into a huge park for a rally to mark Corazon Aquino's rise to power. Yellow ribbons could be seen everywhere. What a wonderful week it's been for most Filipinos. Just 7 days ago, it appeared the country was on the brink of a crushing civil war. a desperate dictator still held power. But within 48 hours, the entire country was transformed. Suddenly, Ferdinand Marcos was gone. Filipinos embraced Corazon Aquino. It was a stunning victory for democracy, but it was a victory that did not come without anger and violence. The end came with a flurry of gunshots. Aquino supporters had been gathering all night outside the gates of the Malacanang Palace. President Marcos's private security force put up a final defense, but the bullets were likely fired into the air, and at this time Marcos had already fled. When the palace troops withdrew, Marcos and Aquino sides finally clashed. As Aquino backers overpowered their opponents, there were demands for an end to the violence. Word spread that Marcos and his family were gone, and the crowds grew. They flooded into the splendor of the dictator's elegant sanctuary. They threw state papers from the windows of the Malacanang Palace and destroyed official portraits of the Marcos family. Earlier in the day, 500 Marcos supporters had gathered at the palace to see him take the oath of office on television. It was a final, desperate attempt to retain power.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, the moment we've been waiting for, the administration of the oath of office of His Excellency President Ferdinand E. Marcos.
But moments later, the broadcast was cut off.
We have had some technical problems, so...
Unknown to Marcos, rebel troops had succeeded in capturing the television station.
We would like to request all the people to get off the firing range, please.
After a brief firefight, it was all over. These were the final shots in what was a mainly peaceful and dramatic end to a brutal struggle for power in the Philippines. And this was Corazon Aquino's day. In a defiant ceremony, she took office as president in the name of the Filipino people.
I, Corazon Cojuangco Aquino, do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear. The long agony is over. We are finally free, and we can be truly proud of the unprecedented way we achieved our freedom.
Salvador Laurel was sworn in as prime minister. Once loyal to Marcos, he brings the political experience Aquino needs. Juan Ponce Enrile, who worked for Marcos for 20 years, remained as defense minister. And General Fidel Ramos, the hero of the weekend revolution, became the new chief of staff. His task will be to reform the military and deal with the communist insurgency. But for all of them, the larger task will be to dismantle a regime that fed on corruption for 20 years. And when the end came, the rebellious mob was composed of bankers and busboys, housewives and businesswomen. Marcos never understood how intense and widespread the hatred against him was. The end of the Marcos regime was largely arranged in Washington, first with cautious diplomacy, then with warnings against violence, and finally with an offer of a safe haven in the United States.
We want to see them continue on in dignity and honor, and we will do everything that we can to see that that comes about.
And no revolution in modern history has been so universally welcomed. Our government quickly recognized the change in power.
Canada has welcomed the election of that government which is in control of the Philippines.
And in Toronto and Vancouver, Filipinos staged victory rallies and saw new hope for their homeland.
In victory, as President Aquino said, we can be magnanimous, and we have to look forward. We cannot keep referring to what happened in the past.
Fellow Canadians, we are inviting you to this momentous occasion when we celebrate finally the triumph of democracy in the Philippines.
When Ferdinand Marcos arrived in Hawaii, an exile on the run, a man without a country, he had to be assisted by a military aid. The United States has guaranteed security for Marcos and his entourage of 88 people. But it's still uncertain if he will be able to remain long in a country hostile to his presence.
The people's power!
Meanwhile, back in Manila, it was day one without Marcos. The new president and vice president made a public appearance and then set the tone for the future.
It is now time to heal the wounds, to forget the past, so that we can speed up the reconciliation and the recovery of the nation.
Mrs. Aquino announced her new cabinet, men and women who have the support of the people. More than 30 political prisoners were released from jail, and there were promises more would be freed soon. People were out in the streets. Schools and shops were reopened. For the first time in 2 decades, the church, business, the people were united behind the government. The 4-day revolution was over, but it was really the end of a revolt that began months earlier with the beginning of the presidential election campaign. When Cory Aquino was first asked to run against Marcos, she was a reluctant candidate. She said she knew nothing about politics, and that became her campaign, her innocence.
I have no experience in cheating, stealing, lying, or assassinating political opponents.
When her husband, Benigno, was murdered, she packed her bags in Boston and took her children home. She said she would not carry on her husband's opposition to the Marcos regime. Corazon Aquino is a daughter of wealth. Educated in American private schools, she majored in French, mathematics, and law.
Those who knew her well knew that they were looking at a very brilliant person, a person who had a brain as a sponge.
But when she did decide to run for the presidency, she rallied millions. Speaking simply and directly, she was something new in a country where power was wielded by evasion and deceit.
I propose to dismantle the dictatorial edifice Mr. Marcos has built. In its place, I propose to build for our people a genuine democracy.
She promised to restore self-respect, and she promised economic recovery. In a country where the foreign debt is a staggering $26 billion and the average wage is $2 a day, that will take some time.
But Cory Aquino is wasting no time restoring basic human rights. She announced today that she's revoking all subversion decrees imposed by Marcos, including laws providing for arrest without formal charges. Next on Newsweek, the shuttle engineers said it shouldn't fly, but NASA officials
and trying to drum up support because they fear the new leadership in Manila will attempt to drive them from office by appointing new local leaders. In this town north of Manila and near the U.S. Clark Air Base, both the provincial governor and the mayor are acting like they're under siege. And the mayor indicates it'll take something like a local mini-revolution to turn him out of his job.
And I will not step down. I will continue issuing orders.
Instability locally could cause problems nationally. And the Aquino people today said they will rewrite the Constitution within the next 90 days to set out the way the national government will work and perhaps allay some local fears. But perhaps the most settling development in what is still a very unstable situation came at a meeting of Marcos's political party today. His diehard supporters said they'll do their best to help the fragile new government avoid political chaos.
That we will extend all kinds of cooperation to have this government operate under the Constitution and the laws.
One other's wounded. Mindanao is the stronghold of communist rebels. The slum of Abdao is so revolutionary, it's called Nicarabdao. Men just out of prison after years of detention said the war is not over.
The revolution of the people will continue. The struggle must continue.
And in Mindanao's Jesuit University, rehearsals continued for a radical play. The theme, which students agreed with, changing a president, is quite superficial.
It's changing the color of a dog to another color. It's the same old thing. It's the same old dog with another color.
Do you have faith in the new government?
A little bit.
Not too much.
Not too much.
There's not much of a middle class in Mindanao, not much of a buffer between owners of plantations and peasants with nothing. In Manila, people's power means freedom of the press, due process, an end to corruption. In Mindanao, it would mean land to the peasants. That's where the line is drawn here. That's what people will die for. Salvador Roldan came out of hiding today, protected by nuns, to bury his family. Far from Manila, here where it's still common practice to kill women and children.
Do we forgive them for the sins they committed? Do we forgive them for the crimes they committed against our people? Is it that easy?
If anyone thought that the struggle was over, just take one last look at the face of the fisherman. Bob Simon, CBS News, Mindanao.
President Aquino's honeymoon may be coming to an end. Today, pro-Marcos loyalists at a half-dozen city halls around the country turned out to oppose Mrs. Aquino's plan to force the replacement of local pro-Marcos mayors around the country. And one other note there, the Ministry of Defense is looking into reports of a roadside ambush 200 miles south of Manila in which 19 people died. That could signal that Aquino's effort for...
Has underlined the difficulties the new president faces as she tries to govern a country that is still largely controlled by supporters of the deposed president, Ferdinand Marcos. Jim Bitterman has the story.
Mayors, governors, and their supporters were barricading themselves in their offices. In several parts of the Philippines, there were well-founded fears that the new Aquino government might try to continue imposing its favorites into local jobs, the same way President Marcos used to. But there were other protests against the new government today, including some by its supporters who don't believe it is moving fast enough to rid the government of Marcos's cronies. In Marcos's hometown of Laoag City, the local politicians, many of whom owe their jobs to his political machine, still shout his name as though he never left the country. The local mayor says he's waiting for orders from the ex-president, but he admits that for the moment he must follow the decrees of what he calls the, quote, de facto government in Manila. At the provincial governor's office, once occupied by Marcos's son Bongbong, his deputy, who took over when father and son fled, was called on by military intelligence men over the weekend. They had heard that he was massing troops for an armed attack. He was able to persuade them that while he might fight the new regime politically, he would not take up arms against it.
While we follow the dictates of the newly formed government, we do not turn our back from our benefactor, President Marcos.
The fragile new government is for the most part still working out of makeshift offices in President Aquino's headquarters. But there is more to running the country than finding adequate office space. Our government still has not legitimized itself under the provisions of the old Constitution.
Ferdinand Marcos stepped down. All 38 justices have assured Mrs. Aquino they will give up their posts. Meanwhile, in Hawaii, the Philippine government there has gone to federal court to recover millions of dollars in currency taken by Marcos and his entourage when they fled the country last week. George Lewis has more.
Washington lawyer Richard Hybe was called to Honolulu in a hurry to try to keep his client's money from being seized. The client is Ferdinand Marcos. When he fled the Philippines last week, he supposedly brought 22 crates full of newly printed Philippine pesos, worth more than $1 million. Lawyers for the Philippine Central Bank have gone to federal court to get it back.
And we believe that the Philippine government has the right to the currency in the current possession of the United States government.
In court, U.S. government lawyers disclosed that customs inspectors are counting the Marcos money and plan to make an inventory available to the Philippine government. Lawyer Hybe, representing Marcos and 20 members of his entourage, doesn't want the amount disclosed.
And the legal issue contains within it matters of privacy and other very definite legal problems.
Hybe may move to get this case transferred to the East Coast, where more claims are pending against Marcos. A New York judge has ordered that Marcos real estate worth an estimated $350 million not
out of sight, but not out of the limelight. As David Dow reports, Marcos may soon be fighting a financial war.
A few miles from the heavy security surrounding Ferdinand Marcos, the first shots were fired in what likely will be a long series of legal battles over the former president's wealth. In federal court, attorneys for the Central Bank of the Philippines filed suit to recover $1.2 million in Philippine pesos taken, it says, illegally from the country. The money arrived here on 2 U.S. Air Force planes carrying Marcos, nearly 90 companions, and more than $30 million in other assets. The Customs Service agreed yesterday to hold on to the money for at least 2 weeks and supply the Philippine government with an inventory of it, a move that a Washington-based attorney for the Marcos Group indicated he'll oppose.
This is a legal issue. And the legal issue contains within it matters of privacy.
Meanwhile, a judge in Manhattan has temporarily blocked any sale of $350 million in New York real estate allegedly owned by Marcos, a move sought by the Aquino government.
For economic recovery, they need whatever properties and assets that rightfully belong to the Filipino people to return to the Philippines.
Additional suits are expected in several other U.S. cities where Marcos critics contend he has stashed more of at least $3 billion in total holdings. David Dow, CBS News, Honolulu.
$15 billion out of the economy while he was the president. A commission on good government has been set up to recover the wealth. So far, it's seized all property and bank accounts associated with the Marcos family in the Philippines. And it's taken over companies owned by Marcos, including the monopoly that supplies electricity to Manila. The head of the new government, Corazon Aquino, spent part of her day being briefed on the security situation in her country. Communist guerrillas in the New People's Army fought against the Marcos regime for 17 years, and they haven't stopped fighting now that Marcos is gone. But Brian Stewart reports the war may not last much longer.
Across large areas of the Philippine countryside, war splutters on, but now at least a ceasefire seems possible. The 20,000 communist-led guerrillas were as surprised as anyone by the sudden downfall of Marcos. They had urged Filipinos to boycott the elections. Now leftist leaders face hard decisions. The wildly popular new government of Cory Aquino has called on the armed left to join a ceasefire. The guerrillas know they may risk isolation if they reject peace talks amid the current euphoria. And newly freed leaders of the leftist National Democratic Front, such as Horacio Morales, concede Aquino would be hard to fight. They want to try a ceasefire.
I think we are now at the point where the possibility of talks, at least be able to sit down and talk and exchange ideas with each other is very imminent. We feel that the armed left will consider this opportunity very favorably.
As a price of peace, the armed left would seek land reform and an end to U.S. military bases. On both issues, Aquino's future policies are unclear. But even without immediate gains, the left may temporarily shelve armed struggle, deciding that reforms make war more difficult. The Philippine military, for example, is expected to become more effective in the field once cleared of its most corrupt officers.
Since the military will be a reformed military and the government is popular government, this only means that it will be a harder opponent to face. No?
Certainly there's much talk of a ceasefire here now, also much confusion. It is simply not known how much Aquino is willing to deal or how soon. But amongst Filipinos, there's a great impatience for results, a feeling that their country will never have a better time than now to put a freeze on that long and destructive civil war. Brian Stewart, CBC News, Manila.
Only $3.3 billion. That was the amount the government spent on goods and services. Former President Ferdinand Marcos is alleged to have accumulated twice that amount, and the new government in the Philippines wants it back. Properties and bank accounts belonging to the Marcos family in the Philippines have been seized, and a special commission is making inquiries into Marcos's holdings in 5 other countries.
$71 million. These and more like them are the acquisitions of Ferdinand Marcos, according to House investigators, plus whatever he brought out of the Philippines when he left. Good evening, I'm Ted Koppel, and this is Nightline. Estimated total value up to $10 billion. That's what the Philippine government charges former President Marcos and his cronies plundered from the nation's wealth. Much of it is now in the United States. But is it up to the U.S. to get it back and give it back? That's our story tonight.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
There is petty larceny, there is grand larceny, and then there appears to be another category altogether that seems to defy easy legal definition. Granted, these things have a way of getting blown out of all proportion, but when allegations of theft and misappropriation move into the range of 20 to 30 billion with a B dollars, the concept of grand larceny seems somehow inadequate. It is charged, and these charges are going to end up in court, that former President Marcos, his family, and numerous close associates have systematically, over the past 30 years, removed billions of dollars from the Philippines. U.S. intelligence sources claim that the Marcos family alone acquired between $2 and $3 billion, much of which they invested in this country over the past several years, and a small percentage of which, as Nightline correspondent James Walker reports, they brought with them on their hasty retreat from the Philippines 1 week ago.
When Ferdinand Marcos began his exile in Hawaii last week, a lot of people who watched felt sympathy for him and his family because they looked tired and appeared to carry just a few possessions with them. A Marcos daughter almost looked pathetic as she clutched a box of Pampers as though it was her dearest possession. Indeed, it apparently was. ABC News has been told that inside that box were not just diapers, but jewelry belonging to Imelda Marcos, wife of the deposed president. It's been reported the same American Air Force cargo jet brought 50 pounds of gold bullion, and each one of the 90 passengers carried $10,000 worth of pesos. But a second C-141 aircraft like this one brought even more loot. 22 crates filled with large amounts of securities and documents, plus 110 million freshly printed pesos worth an estimated $5.5 million. That's money the Central Bank of the Philippines is suing to get back.
Philippine law is very clear that no one can export or remove from the country Philippine pesos in excess of 500 pesos without first submitting to the central bank for approval, gaining that approval, and then removing it. In this case, we have searched the records of the Philippine government, both the customs and the central bank, and have ascertained that no such request for approval was made, none was given, and therefore it's clearly a violation of Philippine law requiring a person to gain approval before exporting an amount in excess of 500 pesos.
When Mrs. Aquino finally won the presidency, she began an international legal battle to recover what she says is money stolen by Marcos from the Philippine people. In New York, her lawyers say the money was used to buy valuable real estate. A partial list includes the Harrow Center in Midtown New York City, cost $60 million. 40 Wall Street, cost $71 million. And Lindemeer, a luxury estate on Long Island, cost $19 million. Lawyer Michael Ratner, who represents the Aquino government, is trying to get a court to issue a more permanent freeze on Marcos' holdings in the New York metropolitan area.
Well, the New York real estate that we're suing on is valued at $350 million. We only think that's the tip of the iceberg. We've heard figures of $5 billion is sort of a conservative figure we've heard, and we've heard people say as high as $30 billion, which seems quite high. That's enough to pay off the entire Philippine national debt.
In addition to the New York property, Ratner says he's also looking into possible Marcos real estate holdings in California, Texas, and New Jersey. Then there is the matter of these boxes filled with valuable china, antiques, paintings, and vases that were spotted in the old Philippine consulate in New York. They had apparently been packaged for shipment to Marcos in Honolulu, but that was stopped by Aquino supporter Ramon Rodriguez.
It's appalling. It's appalling in its extravagance, you know, because there are so many people in the Philippines starving, and you come across a building like this, which you know should have belonged, the money used for this should have gone to the Filipino people.
Anti-Marcos activist Steve Xenakis has been tracing Marcos's financial investments overseas for the past 10 years.
It's not a question of getting a kickback, you know, $50,000 for doing a favor. This is systematically over the years in amounts that are difficult to understand.
To try to get a better understanding, Aquino's American lawyers want U.S. officials to release to them documents Marcos brought with him from Manila.
Because we think those documents to this entire web and intricate network that he set up. They may tell us where those properties are, who the nominees are, where the money came from in the Philippines, what corporations that money went through. Those documents, I think, may be worth billions, much more than the few $1 million he may have brought in.
And tonight, Marcos's presidential yacht, reportedly loaded with various goods, has left Hong Kong, destination unknown. On Friday, U.S. Customs officials say they will give Aquino's lawyers a detailed accounting of the money Marcos, his family, and friends brought with them from Manila. To the United States, the entire episode is extremely embarrassing, coming at a time when it would like to be able to focus attention on the future and President Aquino, rather than on the past and the mistakes of Ferdinand Marcos. This is James Walker for Nightline in New York.
We'll talk later with attorney Peter Weiss, who's being retained by the Philippine government to represent its claims against the Marcos assets. But first, when we return, we'll talk live with Lou Simons, a veteran U.S. reporter in Asia who believes that Marcos and his friends have been draining money out of the Philippines for 30 years. And we'll be talking with Assistant Secretary of State Paul Wolfowitz, whose area of responsibility includes the Philippines. Secretary of State for Asian and Pacific Affairs. And joining us live from Manila, Lou Simons, who is Tokyo correspondent for the San Jose Mercury News, and who believes that State Department cooperation will be critical if the Philippines is to get any money back from the Marcos families. Simons, who's been covering Asia for the past 20 years, is co-author of a recent investigative series for his newspaper entitled Hidden Billions, The Draining of the Philippines. Lou, you have heard what James Walker just reported. I realize you did an extensive series for the San Jose Mercury, and that was about 6 months ago. But what, if anything, has been left out that is important that we need to know about?
Well, what you've talked about basically is money and properties belonging to the Marcoses themselves. You've not touched on properties held by Marcos cronies. We in our series documented 9 of those cronies. Some of those people, I believe, are with the Marcos party at Hickam in Hawaii right now. I think there's a fundamental question in knowing who are those people. It seems quite mysterious that until now we don't know who's on the manifest. We don't know who flew out of here with the President and the First Lady. I, for one, would like to know who's there, and I'd like to know more about their holdings. That's for starters.
All right, let's go right to Secretary Wolfowitz, because this indeed is your area of responsibility. Why don't we know who's there? Is there any particular reason why that list has not been made public?
Well, let me say, we're talking about something now that really is past the range of being a foreign policy question. It's a matter of U.S. law, of determining individuals' rights to privacy, of determining who property belongs to, and this is going to be handled according to U.S. law. Nothing is going to be done outside of the law. No assurances were given to President Marcos of any immunity from U.S. law. So these issues will be pursued in the manner in which they ought to be pursued in the United States, and that is through a proper legal proceeding.
Mr. Secretary, I would agree with you entirely were it not for the fact that the Marcos family and their associates are being extended the hospitality of a U.S. base. That is a government base, is it not?
But, Ted, I think that's quite a different matter from the question of determining who this property belongs to.
No, I do, too. I'm only talking now about who's with him. I mean, Lou Simons raises an interesting point. We don't even know who left with him.
We know who's with them. I think you'd have to ask the lawyers what the reasons are for not disclosing that. But there are
Why doesn't the public know? I'd like to know why the public hasn't been told. I understand that General Ver and his family is with the Marcoses. I'd like to know why General Ver is there. General Ver is a man who the Reagan administration was trying for at least a year, and perhaps more after the Aquino assassination, to get Marcos to remove from the military, to remove him as chief of staff. He never did. He kept him on till the very end. And now this man, who was directly implicated in the murder of President Aquino's husband, is in the United States with the Marcoses as a guest, at taxpayers' expense, I assume, of the United States. Why?
I don't think the issue is taxpayers' expense. Let's go back a little bit. First of all, the key reason these people are here, the key reason the President made the offer to President Marcos to take his family and his close associates and leave was the interest of a peaceful resolution of that crisis a week ago. And I think that was of decisive importance, and it remains of decisive importance to the present and the future of the Philippines, that crisis was resolved with virtually no bloodshed. It's of great importance. I think it's a great achievement, number one. Number two, the Philippines faces very major problems now. The question of getting back property that belongs to it is certainly a very important and valid question. But the most important thing in the Philippines, in fact, is establishing the kind of environment, the kinds of policies that will encourage the return of wealth, not just from abroad, and there's plenty abroad, but from mattresses and from Hong Kong bank accounts. Philippines has one of the highest savings rates in Asia. I think roughly 25% of the GNP goes into savings. That means roughly $16 billion every year being saved in the Philippines, and for at least the last few years, because of the crisis there, that money has not been invested productively.
Secretary Wolfowitz, let me just ask you, because presumably these documents now that were aboard that second plane, the documents that detail precisely what it was that has been taken out over, as Lou Simons and his colleagues have reported, over the past 20 to 30 years, those documents are in the hands of the U.S. government in the form of the Customs Service. Is the information going to be made available to the Aquino lawyers?
Ted, I'm not an expert on U.S. law. I'm sure if U.S. law says that it should be available to the various parties in a lawsuit, it will be made available.
All right, but you're Assistant Secretary of State for that region. What are your recommendations?
I'm Assistant Secretary for State for that region, Ted. I'm not an expert on U.S. law, and I believe these matters should be decided according to the law.
And I'm sure they will be, but what I'm asking you is, from a foreign policy point of view, with regard to the current relationship between the United States and the Philippines, what would you, as Assistant Secretary of State, recommend?
I think it's obvious that we want to have the best possible relationship with this new government. We want to extend every kind of legal cooperation we can to them. But we operate within a system of laws, and we'll follow those laws.
We're going to take a break.
Secretary Wolfowitz.
Hold on just 1 second, Mr. Simons. We'll be back to you in just a couple of minutes. When we come back, however, we'll be joined by Peter Weiss, Ferdinand Marcos, or his associates. Tomorrow, attorneys for Philippine President Aquino will go to court to try to get that order extended. With us now live in our New York studio is Peter Weiss, who will be representing the Philippine government in court tomorrow. What kind of cooperation do you want, and are you getting from the U.S. government in this regard? Or is the U.S. government irrelevant at this point?
Well, the U.S. government could be very relevant, but so far we have not gotten any cooperation.
What are you looking for?
We're looking for the list of documents that came on the plane from Manila to Honolulu, because we believe that that is going to be the best way of establishing where the loot is and how the loot was stolen.
Now, you heard what Secretary Wolfowitz just had to say a moment ago, namely that this will all be done according to law, so presumably, if you're entitled to those documents, you'll get them.
Well, we're dealing here with a situation that is not entirely a legal situation. We're now in a diplomatic situation between the government of the Philippines and the government of the United States. And what Secretary Wolfowitz did not mention was that a formal request was made yesterday in a letter from Mrs. Aquino personally to Ambassador Bosworth in Manila, asking for the inventory, and that was subsequently supplemented by a specific request for the disclosure of the documents. So this whole thing is at a diplomatic level now, which is not entirely a legal level.
Is that, Secretary Wolfowitz, something that is soluble at the diplomatic level? I mean, I almost have a feeling that the fingers are going to be pointing in a half-dozen different directions with the end result that nothing gets done.
I don't think it's right to say nothing will get done, Ted. I think things will get done according to due process in the United States. I don't think that has to take a terribly long time or to take forever, but I think it does need to be done according to law. And I'm hesitant to comment on matters of law, particularly not being a lawyer.
All right, let me just ask you very quickly, and then we'll get back to Lou Simons in the Philippines. You mentioned a moment ago that no assurances were given. I think I'm quoting you correctly when I say that. With regard to the possessions that President Marcos has in this country. Would you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, what was conveyed to President Marcos from the President of the United States was that we would provide him safety in the United States and access to good medical facilities for himself, for his family, and his close associates. And no other assurances were given, or could they be given. In particular, we can't give immunity from U.S. law. These things will be handled according to U.S. law, and if under U.S. law it's established that the property he brought in and that is presently being held by us in custody belongs to someone else, then it will be given to its rightful owner.
When the United States government agreed to make a second Air Force cargo plane available, did you have any impression as to what it was the U.S. Air Force was going to be bringing out? Clothing?
Reasons. All of that property on the second plane, as I think you know, or your listeners should know, is now in custody of U.S. Customs. The Marcos party does not have access to it, and until a decision is made on how to proceed to determine the ownership of it, no one will.
Lou Simon, yeah, go ahead, Mr. Weiss. I think.
Yeah, I'm touched by Mr. Wolfowitz's tender regard for Mr. Marcus's civil liberties, and as an attorney for the Center for Constitutional Rights, I wouldn't want to take issue with him on the legal question. However, I think it's important to note that this regard that is being shown now for his privacy is in sharp contrast with the lack of regard for the thousands and thousands of victims that Mr. Marcos sent to their graves in the Philippines in the last 20 years during the period when the United States was supporting Mr. Marcos. Now, there are many, many documents, not just those in Honolulu, but it stands to reason that the United States, which after all is a pretty good intelligence establishment, has a great deal of information about this loot that we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes. And it would be very helpful, and it would be an act of encouragement to the new government of the Free Philippines, the Aquino government, if the United States were to cooperate in making some of those documents available.
Mr. Secretary?
I think these, Ted, I think these are crucial points that are being made here.
Well, hold on. I'll tell you what. I mean,
it's been no secret to an
hold
entire
on.
succession
Lou, I'll
of,
tell you what. Hold on one second,
yes.
because you're right. There are crucial points being made, but at the very least, let's give the government representative a chance to respond to them. Mr. Secretary?
We are anxious to cooperate with this new government in every way we can, and we will certainly cooperate in this manner to the full extent permitted by U.S. law. But let me emphasize there's a lot to be talked about the future, and I think Mrs. Aquino herself
I promised you that you will have an opportunity at the end of this program, but we're getting there real fast, and then we're not going to have time for that. In direct response to what Mr. Weiss said, you are saying what?
I am saying that we will cooperate with this government in every way that we can. We have laws that have to be followed. We have issues that need to be determined in a proper legal manner, and they will be.
All right. Lou.
Yeah, I think we're begging, or Secretary Wolfowitz is begging an awful lot of crucial questions. It's fine to look to the future, but there's an immediate past that has to be looked to, and there's a long-term past that has to be looked to. There's a whole succession of U.S. administrations that knew precisely what the Marcoses and their cronies were up to for the last 20 years. And it makes no sense whatsoever that the United States Air Force should fly out an entire plane worth load of loot when that could have been left behind. If President Reagan made an assurance to President Marcos that he and his family would be looked after, that takes a whole lot less than two extra freight aircraft. In addition to that, we're begging the question of what kind of a deal was indeed made. I would suggest that from the perspective of Manila, from the perspective of an awful lot of Filipinos in and out of this new administration right now, there's a very strong smell that is wafting this way. And I'd like to know just what those assurances were. And I'll get back to General Ver, and I'll get back to Eduardo Cojuangco. Why are they there? What kind of assurances were made to Marcos? Why not just the Marcoses and their families?
All right.
Who are these
Before we
people
talk
and their
about
possessions?
smells that are wafting this way, could we just set this? I think it's quite clear to most Filipinos, and it's certainly clear to President Aquino, that the United States, particularly in the last 2 years, has played a major role in pushing for basic reforms which in the end led to an election, and which in the end led to a major historic event in the Philippines. And I don't think the smells wafting this way are ones of U.S. complicity with crimes or other mistakes of the Marcos era.
All right, Secretary Wolfowitz, I promised you you'd have a chance for some final thoughts on the Philippines in general. You will have that opportunity in just a moment when we come back.
Money to keep up.
Children, John Stossel tells us if vitamins can really...
Wolfowitz, there are larger issues at stake here for the U.S. government. Name some of them.
Well, I think the most important one to talk about dollar figures is going to be establishing confidence in the Philippine economy. Money that has been going out of the country instead stays in the country, and money from abroad comes in. Filipinos are very talented people, very hardworking. They do very well in the right setting. I think Mrs. Aquino has taken some important, hopeful first steps, and she can keep that up. She has really made a number of remarkable, difficult decisions early on. I think most impressively, the decision to push for a fundamental reconciliation, for a healing of the wounds of the past and addressing the major problems of the future. And we ought to realize those major problems are there. President Marcos is gone. He was part of the problem. but he wasn't the only problem. And what we have now is not the end of the story in the Philippines, but in a sense, the beginning. It is, I think, a very hopeful beginning. It's a very fresh start, and certainly President Aquino has surprised everyone with the skill, shrewdness, courage, and I'd say wisdom that she's displayed. But it's a long road ahead.
Secretary Wolfowitz, I thank you very much. My thanks also to Lou Simons and Peter Weiss. It happens early
Marcos to the verdict of history and establishing her own administration in Manila's Malacañang Palace, the Filipino people remain consumed by the question of how much of their national treasure did the deposed dictator steal and run away with. And not just the Filipinos are curious. Visiting U.S. Congressman Stephen Solars is too.
Well, I think there will be considerable sympathy in the United States for efforts on the part of the government to reclaim assets which were purchased with resources stolen and swindled from the pockets of the Filipino people.
Jovito Salonga says Marcos may have stolen as much as $10 billion. Salonga has a commission charge with getting the money back.
If we can recover even $5 billion, that will be a big boon to the economy.
Getting the money back will not be easy. It's believed Marcos has squirreled away cash in the United States, Latin America, Switzerland, England, and the Bahamas. Lots of cash. Richard Wagner, CBS News, Manila.
Enlisted men and officers at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii are reported today to be fed up with Marcos and his entourage. The base exchange has been closed down twice so the Marcos people could shop in private. And the Officers Club is now an exclusive Marcos mess hall and is off limits to the officers.
Mountains, they rely on the support of the people not to disclose their movements to the government, which is constantly searching for them. Evidence of that support is that in February, in just this region, the guerrillas killed 31 government troops in 4 major ambushes. But now the communists face a big problem. Their political indoctrinators have been moving from village to village, saying that their revolution would get rid of Marcos and bring a new social order. The communist appeal has been based largely on opposition to the former dictator. The fall of Marcos and the way it occurred is just about the worst thing that could have happened to the communists here, because they can't claim credit for it. And now in Corazon Aquino, they face a president who is popular and who, if she plays her cards right, can steal their revolution. This communist official, who insisted on meeting clandestinely, acknowledged the dilemma he and his comrades face.
It's not that type of revolution that we were envisioning. Part of the Marcos camp is still entrenched in the government. It's they who hold the decisive reins of power in the government.
The new government will have to move quickly. Military operations will no longer do. There will have to be more economic help, much of it American. There will have to be a reform of the feudal system, which has prevented farmers from owning their own land. On Negros, owning a water buffalo and a piece of land is still a lifelong dream. That is the fertile soil the communists are ready to cultivate, if Corazon Aquino does not. Garrick Utley, NBC News, Payao Village.
This hidden wealth. It says it has documents which will hold up in U.S. courts, linking Marcos to overseas property worth billions of dollars. Marcos remains in seclusion at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, but some of his aides are stepping out in Honolulu. His top aide, General Fabian Ver, was photographed last night at a Honolulu restaurant. Observers of the Marcos entourage say many of them have been sampling Waikiki's nightlife and seem to like the Hawaiian lifestyle.
Communist insurgency, military and government leaders decided during a closed-door meeting to free unconditionally 4 communists being held for political crimes. Among them, the commander-in-chief of the New People's Army, Bernabe Buscaino.
I think I should join the people, and they are backing Mrs. Aquino. I will help Mrs. Aquino.
Also released, Jose Maria Sison, the founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines.
I'm very happy for both of you and for your families.
There was some dissension within the military over whether it was wise to let the 4 go. Military leaders say they're extending a privilege which won't be repeated, but say it's a test of the communists' good faith.
It's actually extending a hand of friendship to them, and I hope that they will reciprocate it.
Meanwhile, at a Marine battalion base south of the capital, 4 communist rebels captured Sunday were today reunited with their families and given their first hot meal in days. They, too, are to be released in a matter of days.
So for us, it is better to capture one, then treat him properly, then release him. Then we will spread the gospel that we are not that bad.
That strategy of persuading the insurgents to surrender hinges largely on whether the military can also disarm soldiers and civilians loyal to the Marcos regime, who have built up quite an arsenal over the years. The military is trying to grab up the unauthorized weapons peacefully, but General Ramos said today he will only give that 1 week. Edie Magnus, ABC News, Manila.
Meanwhile, this morning it's being reported that the Air Force jet that carried the Marcos party to Hawaii also carried 50 pounds of gold bullion. And sources tell ABC's James Walker that one of Marcos's daughters carried jewelry belonging to her mother, Imelda, hidden inside a box of diapers.
4 political prisoners, including Jose Maria Sison, former chairman of the Filipino Communist Party. Though never convicted of any crime, Sison spent 8 years in prison, 6 of them in solitary confinement. He says he was beaten during interrogations, subjected to torture in which water was forced into his nose, and was chained to a bed for long periods.
But the most intense kind of torture, the most excruciating, was the 18 months of being attached to being chained to the cot.
Also among those released is Bernabe Buscaino, also known as Commander Dante, military leader of the Communist New People's Army. They went from the military prisons where they had been held to a meeting with the new president.
But anyway, I'm very happy for both of you and for your families.
Communist insurgency is one of the serious military challenges to the new government.
Have now come forward. According to a lawyer in the case, the defendants reportedly confessed to their involvement in the assassination and implicate Marcos, his wife Imelda, former Chief of Staff General Fabian Ver. All are now in Hawaii. One of the prosecutors says that other prosecutors and even judges had been pressured to drop the charges against the 26 accused of killing Benigno Aquino. They refused to drop the charges, but eventually acquitted the defendants.
The president said, thanked them and said, well, you know, I'm a person that knows how to reciprocate.
Navarez was the chief investigator in the civilian inquiry that led to the charges against the 26.
In the light of the evidence that we had unearthed, I'm convinced that the military were engaged in a conspiracy to assassinate Senator Aquino.
General Ver and the others went free last December after a 7-month trial. Much of the prosecution's crucial testimony was thrown out by the judges. Based on today's new allegations, some prosecutors think there is enough reason to reopen the trial and charge the Marcoses. Aquino's widow, Corazon, the new president, hasn't commented on the reports, but her views are well known.
I still hold Mr. Marcos responsible for the assassination of Ninoy.
Some of the people acquitted in the Aquino murder have now been placed under house arrest until Mrs. Aquino reorganizes the judiciary and sets the stage for a new trial. Steve Mallory, NBC News, Manila.
Jaime Cardinal Sin of the Philippines said today that the overthrow of Marcos could also have an effect on the communist insurgency. He said in Rome that some of the anti-government rebels have indicated that they will come down from the hills and stop fighting later this month. 4 more political dissidents jailed by the Marcos regime were freed today by Corazon Aquino. They went immediately to her office for what was called a very casual meeting. The 4 included the founder of the Philippines Communist Party, a suspected former rebel leader, and 2 alleged rebel assassins. It now looks as if Ferdinand Marcos will call Hawaii his home in exile. Honolulu's mayor said today that it was now 99% certain that Marcos would settle there.
But Defense Minister Enriquez says it'll show the communists that
it is a friendly government. It is a government that must not be feared by its own people, that it is actually extending a hand of friendship to them, and I hope that they will reciprocate it. This is a test of their good faith.
It's a test to see whether any of these gestures will have an impact on an estimated 16,000 communist insurgents spread among remote mountain areas, an insurgency which grew steadily through the Marcos years. The military under Aquino now seeking new ways to deal with them, using the carrot more than the stick. These 4 insurgents captured last week 300 miles west of Manila will be released soon. 26-year-old Celestino Tullo joined the communists only 7 months ago because he said he had no work, no land. He's now seeing his son for the first time in a government gesture which it's hoped will cause others to lay down their arms. Jim Laurie, ABC News, Manila.
Some of the other people who Ferdinand Marcos had imprisoned are going to pursue him through the American legal system. Mr. Marcos faces a very long list of legal challenges. As ABC's John Martin reports, some of the political prisoners have made claims of torture.
The year was 1978, and inside this detention center outside Manila, political prisoners told ABC News of their ordeal.
I was a journalist. They applied lighted cigarette on my toenails and on my breasts, burned my genitals.
Yesterday in San Francisco, 13 Filipinos sued former President Marcos for $55 million for false imprisonment and torture. Today, their lawyer called for justice.
We've sued for the violation of human rights, which is now an international tort recognized in the federal court.
This California suit adds one more legal claim on assets Ferdinand Marcos is assumed to have taken from the Philippines. Today in New York, a judge extended for 2 weeks a ban on selling 5 properties worth $350 million. He said lawyers for the new government could ask Mr. Marcos directly if he owns the properties.
What to expect to ask him? Oh, we'll have lots of questions to ask him.
Whether Mr. Marcos will ever have to pay the claims is clouded by confusion. What were the terms by which he was offered asylum?
If you want me to sort of jot down what falls under the heading of the offer to President Marcos by the United States to stay in the United States as long as he so desires, I don't have anything to draw for you.
Unless there is a secret agreement, Mr. Marcos could face a long, costly battle to keep his possessions. The same battle facing his government and people who claim damages for those long years he was dictator. John Martin, ABC News, Washington.
And one other note from the Philippines today. Mrs. Aquino toured the Malacanang Palace, the old home of Ferdinand Marcos. Mrs. Aquino says she will not live in the palace, but will use it as an office and to host official functions.
All are now in Hawaii. One of the prosecutors says that other prosecutors and even judges...
Insurgency in the Philippines. The Army didn't want to let them go. It argued their release would set back the Army's campaign to end the guerrilla war in the country. But Aquino wanted to keep her election promise to free all political prisoners.
And we are now ready to release Mr. Maria Sison.
Jose Maria Sison had been in jail for 8 years without ever being put on trial. He didn't talk about it in prison, but he admitted today that he was the founder of the Philippine Communist Party and the leader of the guerrilla army. Aquino released him and 3 other former guerrillas without any conditions.
But anyway, I'm very happy for both of you and for your families.
Sison said today he didn't know if a guerrilla army is still needed.
Congressman Stephen Solars greeted President Corazon Aquino, extending a formal invitation for her to come to Washington to address a joint session of Congress sometime this year. His real mission, however, is to swap information with Aquino on the holdings of deposed President Ferdinand Marcos and his wife in the U.S. In an effort to recover assets Solars says were swindled from the country's coffers. Solars met behind closed doors with Senator Jovita Salonga, who heads a commission here investigating the Marcos hidden wealth abroad.
Far better that these resources should be used to help the poor people of Manila than to help the Marcoses in Manhattan.
Marcos' handling of the murder of Aquino's husband, Benigno Aquino, was labeled by Solars today a total travesty of justice. This amid calls by Aquino's chief of staff to reopen the case.
It is important. Perhaps Mrs. Aquino is not very, I don't know what her attitude is, but we have been besieged by calls about the Aquino assassination.
Aquino today refused to say what her attitude is on pursuing Marcos' alleged involvement in her husband's death. She has stated publicly she has no desire to extradite Marcos back for trial. Edie Magnus, ABC News, Manila.
And Philippine Cardinal Jaime Sin met in Rome this morning with Pope John Paul.
puta! Oh, di na dyan magpapatok! Di na dyan magpapatok! Oh, labanan! Oh! Pasok na namin! Sakat na! Abi ko na! Dito. Paputukan tayo. Kuwet, magsuko. Di, tayo na. Oh, yan ang kaiwan!
Suddenly, reinforcements from the government appeared on the road.
Who's that? Enemy! Soldier! Go doon! Go! Sige!
He wounded?
Yes.
The NPA casualties, only 2 wounded. All 15 government soldiers in the truck were killed.
How
many guns?
27.
27?
Yeah.
Why do you fight? What do you want?
Revolution Agrario.
You want land reform?
Yeah.
Land reform, that's why you fight.
American officials estimate the communist guerrilla movement has between 15 and 20,000 people under arms in the Philippines, and during the last 5 years, while Marcos ruled, it was growing at the rate of about 20% a year. Communist leaders insist that their fight will go on, but others in the Philippines, including Jaime Cardinal Sin, the most powerful church leader in that country, now believe the communist movement will lose power. Beginning tomorrow morning on NBC's Today program, John Alpert will have a series of reports on the NPA as the communist guerrilla movement is called in the Philippines. Also coming up here tonight.
Moved to accommodate a helicopter, but none ever came. John Cheyenne, CBS News, the Port of Manila.
Philippines Cardinal Jaime Sin spoke in Rome today of how the Roman Catholic Church had helped to overthrow Ferdinand Marcos. Another instance, correspondent Mark Phillips reports, of the church as an increasingly active political force.
Cardinal Jaime Sin led a mass for Filipinos in Rome this evening, but his main reason for coming here was to explain the leading role the church had played in the Philippine Revolution. Sin himself had openly called on the people to support the opposition to Marcos. His actions were just the latest example of how the Catholic Church has become a major force for change in the Third World. Despite hints from the Vatican that the Pope was uncomfortable with the role played by the Philippine Church, Sin said today that his meeting with Pope John Paul II had gone well.
I just thank him for supporting our move in the Philippines when we were in a very critical situation.
Just how active the Pope's support was during the Philippine Revolution is open to question. But in 2 recent cases, the Philippines and Haiti, the Church's role in toppling a dictator was undeniable. John Paul himself had told the people of Haiti they had to fight oppression. In Poland, the Pope has actively supported the outlawed Solidarity movement. In Nicaragua, the Church had helped overthrow the Somoza dictatorship, although the Pope now opposes those priests who participate in the Marxist government there. The Pope tells his priests to avoid political involvement, yet his own actions and decrees leave room for a broader interpretation.
I think it is too easy to simply say that the task of the church is spiritualism. You can't just hover around in spiritualism. Even the Holy Spirit came down concretely.
Many see Chile as the next place where the church may play a concrete role. Already priests can be found trying to separate riot police from protesting crowds. Already it's hard to distinguish between simply working for social change and getting into politics. Mark Phillips, CBS News, Rome.
At the treatment he is getting from American officials, and at one point even threatened to leave the country. A threat, incidentally, they do not expect him to carry out. At the same time, a dozen of those who fled the Philippines with Marcos are already asking.
President Corazon Aquino in Manila. He says he'll support efforts to recover billions of dollars that Marcos and his family allegedly stole. 2 Yugoslavs were detained.
Only 1 mile from a Philippine army base, more than 70 NPA guerrillas planned the ambush of a military convoy. What's going to happen when the military truck enters the zone?
So the troops will attack the coming trucks.
Your troops are going to attack the truck when he gets in the zone. At dawn, the guerrillas took over the peasants' huts near the road. The families moved 50 feet back. It looks like they're about ready to start the fight soon. How do you feel? Nervous. Suddenly, reinforcements from the government appeared on the road.
Go, go, go down! Go! Go, sige! Who's that? Enemy! Enemy! Soldier! Go, go, go down! Go! Go, sige!
The NPA casualties, only 2 wounded. All 15 government soldiers in the truck were killed.
Isa, dalawa, tatlo,
How many guns?
27.
27?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why do you fight? What do you want?
Revolution agrario.
You want land reform?
Yeah.
Land reform, that's why you fight.
Communist guerrillas as Corazon Aquino tried to solidify her grip on power. It turns out there was a freelance journalist accompanying the guerrillas as they planned and
executed. This ceremony took place at the presidential palace. At least one other post has yet to be filled.
Household staff have now expressed a desire to go back.
The members of the group are free agents. They may depart the U.S. at any time.
Their departure would ease the logistical problems of the U.S., which is providing shelter and protection for the entire Marcos entourage. Discussions between Marcos and the U.S. government, American sources say, have become increasingly tense. State Department representatives have told the former president that he must start providing the housing and security for his party sometime soon. State Department officials say Ferdinand Marcos has reacted with frustration and anger to the manner in which he's being treated by the U.S. and at one point even threatened to leave the country, a threat which no one expects him to carry out. American sources say of particular irritation to Marcos is the growing list of legal challenges to his financial holdings in the U.S. and the State Department's refusal to grant him immunity from
allows
US
the
law.
AIDS virus to infect humans.
Has absolute control over his future.
With the communist insurgents 250 miles south of Manila. This morning he begins a series of 5 reports. Good morning, John. What are we about this morning?
Well, today we're going to take a look at the guerrillas' response to Mrs. Aquino's proposed ceasefire. But I must warn the audience that this contains some really horrible scenes of military violence, and if you might not want to see that, and especially all the children, they shouldn't watch this segment. This report begins when we meet the guerrillas. They've moved into position only a mile from a military base. In your troop, how many?
70 plus.
70 plus.
Bali an tuyo kaskan sa ton pagurulay man sana inin maulit daa makuha.
You're planning to ambush a military convoy tomorrow? Where's the truck going to be when you hit it? Where do you think that the truck will be?
Sa Inhali. Enemy trucks will be passing here. We will attack them.
You're trying to get their guns. What's this now? Dry run?
Oh, dry run.
Dry run? Yeah. So after they take his gun, they run away?
Yeah.
Practice finished. Over?
Okay.
This is the end.
Starting now.
It's starting now?
Yeah.
What time is it? 1 o'clock? Where are we going?
On the road.
To the road?
The highway's very close. Yeah, very close highway. Another car.
Another car?
Yeah. Very close highway.
Your family's been moved away from the road, but you're trapped here. What are you doing?
Hiding.
You're hiding?
Yeah.
It looks like they're about ready to start the fight soon. How do you feel?
Nervous.
Alex! Alex! Umadala ka sinintihan! Sus! Dumalaga ka digde! Para nadapakan mo may gugutan! Pait na tayo dito nagsuporta! Oh, di na dyan magpapatok! Di na dyan magpapatok! Oh, labanan! Oh! Pasok na, Abi! Sakat na! Abi, kuno! Lito. Paputukan ta, squad magsuko. Di, tayo na. Balik naman may padil. Galing, putin. Oh, yan ang kaiwan. Yan si kaiwan, ang karane. Dali na nung.
Suddenly, a column of government soldiers appeared on the highway.
Go, Dun! Go, sige! Go, dali!
Coming, right?
Go!
He wounded?
Yes.
Yes? Where was he hit? Here? In the side?
There, and there.
2 times? Yeah?
Well, I'll go there.
Is he okay? Is he okay?
Okay.
Yeah. Everyone in the truck dead?
Yeah.
The peasants, the farmers always help you when you escape like this?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
How many?
27 also.
27?
27.
27? Did you get a gun today?
Yes.
What was it?
An M16 made in the Philippines.
What do you want? Why are you fighting?
Well, you see, we want to change the system.
And what do you want?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of poor people in the countryside and a few rich, you know, and that's what we like to change.
When is that going to happen? Soon?
Maybe, I'm not sure. So,
You'll stay in the mountains until then?
yeah.
John, since you knew in advance that deadly attack was going to take place, don't you have any problems with concealing that knowledge?
Well, I didn't know the extent of that attack. When I actually saw what was happening, I was horrified. I had never seen anything like that before in my life. I was rather surprised.
Did Mrs. Aquino make a mistake in granting freedom to the NPA leaders that had been in prison?
No, I think that she has to pursue the promises that she made before the election, but even more important than that, she did promise to make some economic reforms, and she promised to control the army. If she does that type of thing, she might make some progress with them. Otherwise, I think they're going to stay and they're going to fight. They've been there for 20 years.
We'll look forward to 4 more of the reports starting on Monday. Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you.
8:22. We're back in a moment. This is Today on NBC.
Got a tip about Marcos' planned arrests. He called General Ramos for support, and the revolt was on.
From his base in central Manila, Enrile began making phone calls, the first to his wife, the second to the American ambassador. For his part, General Ramos got and stayed in touch with the American military attaché's office, where American experts, using electronic intelligence gathering means, were keeping a continuous scorecard on which military units were rebelling and which remained loyal to Marcos. Monday morning, February 24th, a turning point. Helicopter crews defected. The rebels now had, for the first time, the means to actually attack Marcos. What they worried they did not have in sufficient quantity was fuel and arms. A request was made to the American ambassador. Washington replied that the U.S. would refuel the helicopters so long as they were not used to attack Marcos or civilians. There were more defections, including fighter pilots. With the rebel Air Force now growing, there was a need to find a safe place to base it. Clark Field, the sprawling complex the United States rents from the Philippines, was that place. By Tuesday, February 25th, Marcos was surrounded in his palace.
That evening, 4 helicopters under the command of General Teddy Allen, head of the Joint U.S. Military Assistance Group for the Philippines, flew into the besieged palace to extricate Marcos and his entourage from their predicament. But not everybody and everything would fit into the helicopters, and so a second American operation got underway.
At a dock on the river that runs through the palace grounds, unmarked crates and scores of soldiers still loyal to the president and still in uniform were loaded onto a Navy barge and transported downriver to Manila Bay. At a fish restaurant on the bay and near the U.S. Embassy, Americans in civilian dress forced the manager to reopen her place so that the barge could land at its wharf. The next day, Marcos fled the Philippines, leaving a few items behind in American hands. According to General Ramos, crates and crates of money and gold. The general immediately demanded that the U.S. return the valuables to the Philippine people.
What happened to your request?
Well, it has not been honored so far.
In the end, it was an armed insurrection with very little bloodshed, something for which many here claim credit. The Filipino people, as they'll proudly tell you, gave birth to the revolution. But increasingly clear is that America was its midwife. Jim Bitterman, NBC News, Manila.
Some of what Marcos took with him from Manila was itemized today by a federal judge in Hawaii. Among the 300 or so crates shipped on 2 U.S. transport planes were 22 boxes filled with Philippine peso notes worth $1.5 million U.S. dollars. The money is being claimed by the Central Bank of the Philippines and by Marcos. U.S. Customs will hold on to it for the time being. The 89 people who fled the Philippines with Marcos 10 days ago won't be going anywhere else anytime soon because the new Philippine government has canceled their passports, thus restricting their travel.
Forces Deputy Chief of Staff Fidel Ramos. Marcos had planned, immediately after Habib was gone, to have the 2 men, Corazon Aquino, and more than 100 other people arrested. But Enrile, who was having coffee with friends at this Manila restaurant, got a tip about Marcos' planned arrests. He called General Ramos for support, and the revolt was on. From his base in central Manila, Enrile began making phone calls, the first to his wife, the second to the American ambassador. For his part, General Ramos got and stayed in touch with the American military attaché's office, where American experts, using electronic intelligence gathering means, were keeping a continuous scorecard on which military units were rebelling and which remained loyal to Marcos. Monday morning, February 24th, a turning point. Helicopter crews defected. The rebels now had, for the first time, the means to actually attack Marcos. What they worried they did not have in sufficient quantity was fuel and arms. A request was made to the American ambassador. Washington replied that the U.S. would refuel the helicopters so long as they were not used to attack Marcos or civilians. There were more defections, including fighter pilots. With the rebel Air Force now growing, there was a need to find a safe place to base it. Clark Field, the sprawling complex the United States rents from the Philippines, was that place. By Tuesday, February 25th, Marcos was surrounded in his palace. At a dock on the river that runs through the palace grounds, unmarked crates and scores of soldiers still loyal to the president and still in uniform were loaded onto a Navy barge and transported downriver to Manila Bay. At a fish restaurant on the bay and near the U.S. Embassy, Americans in civilian dress forced the manager to reopen her place so that the barge could land at its wharf. The next day, Marcos fled the Philippines, leaving a few items behind in American hands. According to General Ramos, crates and crates of money and gold. The general immediately demanded that the U.S. return the valuables to the Philippine people.
What happened to your request?
Well, it has not been honored so far.
Congressman Stephen Solars, who has returned from the Philippines, says he found what he calls dynamite documentation that Ferdinand Marcos secretly acquired vast real estate holdings in New York. Solars says he can't yet divulge details of what he saw, but that it will be presented in due course to the courts. Charges that Ferdinand Marcos was busily feathering his nest at the expense of the Philippine people continue to grow. Now there is the case of the $2 billion misunderstanding. Jim Bitterman reports from Manila that so many hands dipped into a nuclear power plant project, nothing was left for the people.
From many angles, it seems a folly. One might wonder why the Philippines needs a nuclear power plant to begin with, given its large coal reserves. One might wonder why a nation of acute poverty would spend itself $2 billion into debt to build something like this, or why it was built on the slope of a volcano and on top of a fault line. And one might wonder what happened to the estimated $80 million commission Westinghouse Electric paid to get the contract.
The commission shall be charged with the task.
The investigation of corruption that's begun here may answer some of the questions and may well confirm everyone's suspicions that the powerful have become incredibly rich because of projects like the Philippines nuclear plant.
Graft
corruption, commissions, we still haven't been able to get hold of all the documents. But I think we have documents showing who got money and how much.
And does this committee member have any doubt that it was President Marcos who got the biggest share?
We have no doubt of it.
As huge as the graft involved in the construction of the nuclear power plant might seem to outside observers, even more striking is that to insiders here, it seemed neither surprising nor out of the ordinary.
One supporter of Marcos, who was an opponent of the power plant, has computer printouts of the project's thousands of defects and estimates that 20 to 30% of the cost of public works projects in the Philippines has gone into the pockets of public officials, everyone from the top man down.
When you are a president of the Philippines, it is impossible not to make money.
For now, it seems unlikely that the $2 billion nuclear plant will ever generate electricity. The accomplishment for which the ex-president and his friends are more remembered here is their skill at enriching themselves. Jim Bitterman, NBC News, Manila.
Ferdinand Marcos and family are planning to move, according to sources in Hawaii, into 2 hillside homes in Honolulu. Marcos is expected to move early next week into a complex he plans to rent, which was up for sale for $995,000. Currently, Marcos and 69 people in his party are quartered at Hickam Air Force Base in Honolulu. His new home has a hot tub, solar heating, and a fireplace.
He's in a ritzy part of Honolulu, and he plans to move in the next week.
Have been using the U.S. Air Base on Hawaii, Hickam Field, as a sanctuary. Some Hawaiian officials have suggested the deposed leader move to an island off the Hawaiian coast, citing safety and privacy as the main benefits.
To 2 hillside homes in Honolulu, Marcos and his entourage could move into the heavily guarded homes as early as next week. The Marcos family has been staying at Hickam Air Force Base since fleeing their homeland last month. Meanwhile, in France, former Haitian President Jean-Claude Duvalier
store builds for hundreds of thousands of dollars of designer dresses. And according to one expert, Imelda Marcos would buy $1 million worth of jewelry at one store in the morning, then buy $2 million worth of antiques from another store in the afternoon.
Perhaps a lot of it in the United States, up to $10 billion. But whether it's only 2 or 3 billion, kind of a paltry sum, should we cooperate with the Philippines in trying to return that money to them? Or did, in fact, the United States sort of make a deal with Marcos? If you'll leave quietly, we won't make a stink about the money. George?
I wish the people in this country were, some people in this country were as excited and angry about the Sandinistas as they are about the number of shoes in Imelda Marcos' closet. There is an element at this point, Sam, it seems to me, of piling on Marcos. He was a dictator and he was corrupt, but he also did some services for the United States. And we want to send a signal to some other dictators who may one day want to leave their countries and come live here or elsewhere, that they won't be hounded indefinitely. It seems to me that the object here is not to make perfect justice available in the case of Mr. Marcos, but to guarantee that the lesson seen by other regimes around the world is that you can leave your country, as Marcos did, and not be persecuted indefinitely.
And of course, the reverse side of your argument, I would suggest, is that if you're a big dictator and we do that to Marcos, then you can do anything you want, any misdeed, stash away all the money, and know that the United States will, in a pragmatic sense, take the view that that's all right.
No, it's in the first place, it's not our job to guarantee that perfect justice is done in the Philippines. Consistent with American law, his property can or cannot be sued for by the regime in the Philippines, but consistent with our law, and it's not the most important thing at this point.
Charlie, I interrupted.
Well, I just think it's a question of fairness. I mean, God bless you, George, but I mean, when the American people's basic sense of fairness, I think, in all this is severely violated. I don't think anybody wants to deny the man comfort, wants to deny him a nice home and whatever, but when people are getting off airplanes carrying Pampers boxes full of money, and when they've got $350 million worth of real estate in New York City, that's not... that goes beyond, I think, what...
American sense of fairness is not the most important thing. That's a kind of self-indulgence. The most important thing is the future of the Philippines and the future of U.S. dealings with future dictators.
Well, now
Where do you
that's
weigh
the
in?
issue. Now, what the administration is doing is trying to play some sort of a neutral role here as the holder of the evidence, some of the evidence, and have the Aquino government sue in American courts for return of money, and the United States government acts as a neutral. If you're interested in the future of the Philippines and the future of American-Philippine relations, it seems to me that it would be wise to quietly put a few FBI agents on the case to help the Aquino government find out what's there and recover it through the courts. In this strictly neutral stance, it seems to me, is not in the long-term interest of the United States. I understand your point about other dictators, but there is something monstrous about the extent of corruption you've got here. I mean, this is a country whose per capita income must be around $300, and you've got Imelda Marcos going out and buying $2 million worth of jewelry in the morning and $5 million worth of antiques in the afternoon, and just tons of boodle, you know. Now, the Philippine people know about all this, and if the United States is perceived as standing in the way of the recovery of those assets, it doesn't do us any good in the long term.
Okay, I want to talk about two leave takings that were in the news last week. Very quickly, Anatoly Dobrinin, the longtime Soviet ambassador, I guess since '62 to the United States.
All boils down to economics, right? Is Mrs. Aquino going to make a difference?
I really don't know. I think that's the biggest task of her administration. If she's able to give people in the countryside some hope, then I think that she could make some progress.
How typical was that foray?
I don't think it's that typical. It was a very well-equipped, well-trained group of Marines. These guys can have some effect, but the typical troops have had all their funds stolen by their superior officers, so they steal chickens from the farmers and they create a lot of resentment. This group does well. The typical troops have trouble.
Okay. John, we'll look forward to the next three parts all this week. Thank you.
Valuables. The deposed president did leave something behind, a videotape record of his years at the palace. Jerry Bowen had an exclusive look at some of the tapes.
The final hours of Ferdinand Marcos at the presidential palace in Manila. Thousands of loyalists cheering the failing dictator who was soon to be told by his American friends to cut and run. Scenes faithfully preserved by his personal camera crews, as they'd done countless times before. When Marcos fled, the palace tapes remained behind, an intriguing and potentially incriminating collection. Hundreds of hours of recorded history broadcast to glorify the deposed dictator. Hundreds more hours of private tapes, yet to be seen or analyzed by the new government. Extravagant parties on the presidential yacht, decadent by the standards of this Catholic nation. First Lady Imelda Marcos dancing last fall with then U.S. Consul General Vernon McCanich. The First Lady giving presents to the Catholic hierarchy at the palace last Christmas. And singing at the palace New Year's party. Lots of the First Lady. And the 1983 wedding of daughter Irene. Military cadets were trotted out to salute the father of the bride for that affair. The new government has not promised to release the tapes, only to review them. Review the revelations and the reminders. Cardinal Jaime Sin, moral leader of the quiet revolution, elbow to elbow with Marcos at New Year's. And new Chief of Staff Fidel Ramos in the recent past at the left hand of the ex-president. There is much to interest the Philippine people. The world saw Marcos welcome General Fabian Ver back to the fold last fall after the military was acquitted in the murder of opposition politician Benigno Aquino. But the palace withheld these pictures of the ex-president greeting the other alleged conspirators, one of whom has again been accused as the killer of the new president's husband. In many ways, the Aquino murder was the beginning of the end for Marcos, coupled with the economic disaster he and his cronies created. Disaster and despair measured by the growing number of people who find their daily bread in the garbage dumps.
Another deposed leader in search of a country is Jean-Claude Duval.
The world saw Marcos welcome General Fabian Ver back to the fold last fall after the military was acquitted in the murder of opposition politician Benigno Aquino. But the palace withheld these pictures of the ex-president greeting the other alleged conspirators, one of whom has again been accused as the killer of the new president's husband. In many ways, the Aquino murder was the beginning of the end for Marcos, coupled with the economic disaster he and his cronies created. Disaster and despair measured by the growing number of people who find their daily bread in the garbage dumps. And that is why this party aboard the presidential yacht will interest the people too. A birthday party last September for daughter Irene, the last time Marcos was aboard the vessel. Ferdinand Jr., nicknamed Bong Bong, governor of the family's home province, is the man in the flashing bow tie. There was food and dancing and live music, including the revelers' version of a song that last year was a rallying cry to feed the poor. This version is memorable for its enthusiasm. Memorable, too, because the former First Family and their friends didn't realize how hungry their own people were. Hungry for political change at the very least. The palace tapes CBS News gained access to are but a fraction of the library and the legacy Ferdinand Marcos left behind. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Manila.
And part of the presidential palace compound, once occupied by Marcos, now is the office of President Corazon Aquino. The Marcos living quarters will be turned into a museum. Jean-Claude Duvalier of Haiti.
President Corazon Aquino of running a dictatorship. They held a news conference this morning to say that Aquino's rule is not governed by any laws and that the legitimate president of the Philippines is still Marcos. Just what kind of a president was made clearer in some tapes broadcast for the first time today. They were left behind in the palace when Marcos fled the country. Jerry Bowen of CBS News reports on the lavish lifestyle they portray.
The final hours of Ferdinand Marcos at the presidential palace in Manila. Thousands of loyalists cheering the failing dictator who was soon to be told by his American friends to cut and run. Scenes faithfully preserved by his personal camera crews, as they'd done countless times before. When Marcos fled, the palace tapes remained behind, an intriguing and potentially incriminating collection. Hundreds of hours of recorded history broadcast to glorify the deposed dictator. Hundreds more hours of private tapes, yet to be seen or analyzed by the new government. Extravagant parties on the presidential yachts, decadent by the standards of this Catholic nation. First Lady Imelda Marcos dancing last fall with then U.S. Consul General Vernon McCanage. The First Lady giving presents to the Catholic hierarchy at the palace last Christmas. And singing at the palace New Year's party. Lots of the First Lady. And the 1983 wedding of daughter Irene. Military cadets were trotted out to salute the father of the bride for that affair. The new government has not promised to release the tapes, only to review them. Review the revelations and the reminders. Cardinal Jaime Sin, moral leader of the quiet revolution, elbow to elbow with Marcos at New Year's. And new Chief of Staff Fidel Ramos in the recent past at the left hand of the ex-president. There is much to interest the Philippine people. The world saw Marcos welcome General Fabian Baer back to the fold last fall after the military was acquitted in the murder of opposition politician Benigno Aquino. But the palace withheld these pictures of the ex-president greeting the other alleged conspirators, one of whom has again been accused as the killer of the new president's husband. In many ways, the Aquino murder was the beginning of the end for Marcos, coupled with the economic disaster he and his cronies created. Disaster and despair measured by the growing number of people who find their daily bread in the garbage dumps. And that is why this party aboard the presidential yacht will interest the people too. A birthday party last September for daughter Irene, the last time Marcos was aboard the vessel. Ferdinand Jr., nicknamed Bong Bong, governor of the family's home province, is the man in the flashing bow tie. There was food and dancing and live music, including the revelers' version of a song that last year was a rallying cry to feed the poor. This version is memorable for its enthusiasm. Memorable, too, because the former First Family and their friends didn't realize how hungry their own people were. Hungry for political change at the very least. The palace tapes CBS News gained access to are but a fraction of the library and the legacy Ferdinand Marcos left behind. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Manila.
The communist insurgents there, the New People's Army. This morning, we've got a look at how the NPA operates in one of its strongholds. That's in the mountains about 250 miles south of Manila. That's where you went. Good morning, John.
Right, good morning. Yeah, the guerrillas have been there in the past 20 years trying to make the revolution with the peasants. But with the fast-changing events in Manila, they sort of seem like they were a little bit out in left field. So everybody in the country, even the NPA, is sitting around listening to the radio.
Right. Yeah, we've been monitoring that event yesterday morning.
Yeah.
And until today, we're monitoring what is happening in Manila.
Is this your house here? Is this your house?
Yes.
Yeah? The NPA is staying in your house? You have a house guest? How many soldiers here? How many NPA
1, 2,
here?
3, 4, 5, 6.
Six soldiers staying here. Casteria, what's for breakfast today?
We have a little corned beef brought by some of our friends from the cities.
You're feeding all these NPA people here in your house. You are cooking for them. Are you nervous that the government is going to come and find you?
Sometimes.
Yeah? But you don't care?
Sometimes I feel nervous.
Sometimes you're nervous. Papa, how many pigs do you have? How many pigs? Oh, just one pig? Only one. How much money can you make from your farm each month? How much?
300 a month.
That's only like 10 pesos. That's like 50 cents a day.
Yes.
50 cents. And Papa, how many children do you have?
8.
8 children on 50 cents a day. Can you get enough food?
Sometimes.
Food? Sometimes.
We find many foods.
But sometimes.
But sometimes none.
In this area, some people treat the NPA almost like a government. Hello.
Hello.
Who's this, Spring? Who is this?
It's the chief of the village.
Oh, yeah? The village chief?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. What's he doing?
He's giving a tax.
He's paying taxes?
Yeah.
And who's that, the tax collector?
Yeah. Jadi yung sanggato sa SOM, tapos naman niya din 50, kontribusyon nino.
How much money are you giving her? How much money?
170 pesos all.
You're paying 170 pesos tax each month? Once a month?
Yes, sir.
Uh-huh. How many years have you been supporting the NPA? How many years?
Lambi ng 2 taon.
Tuang Tao, what's that mean?
That means 2 years.
2 years he's been helping you guys. Yeah. Uh-huh. Hello.
Hello.
Is this your house?
Yeah.
At night, the NPA even invites itself over to the local mayor's house. Are you afraid when the people from the NPA come to your house? You nervous?
Yes.
Oh. She is? And how about you? Do you get nervous? I mean, you're the local, almost like the local mayor.
Not nervous, but slightly jittery.
Jittery?
Yeah.
What interests the guerrillas most is the mayor's video collection of Hollywood movies. Unfortunately, his Betamax has seen better days. Your Betamax is not working. But after a month in the mountains, the guerrillas will watch anything. They'll also eat anything and everything in the mayor's kitchen. What happens when the government troops come? Are you friendly with the government troops also?
Yes.
So you're sort of like, what, walking a tightrope? Yes?
Yeah.
In this region, the NPA continues to train members in guerrilla warfare and Marxist ideology. They sit in class day and night until they are ready to go out and spread the word. Bring, class again today?
Yes.
How long are your classes?
11 hours, almost 2 weeks.
3 weeks? You've had classes 11 hours a day?
Yeah.
You guys are up here, you're cleaning your guns. You seem like, I mean, I'm confused because everybody in Manila seems happy. They're dancing in the streets. Marcos is gone. What happens if Mrs. Aquino says, come on, boys, let's stop this? Could you work with her?
If she will implement what the people wants.
Otherwise?
Otherwise, we continue fighting.
John, that tax we saw them paying, is that payable on demand? Is that a forced tax? What happens if they don't?
I don't think it's a good idea to try and avoid it. Those guerrillas are going to be there the next day, and the next day the Army comes, and then the Army leaves. But the guerrillas are always there.
That's an obvious advantage. Is that to say that the peasants are more sympathetic to the NPA, or they're just there and they don't want to?
I think it depends on the individual peasants. I found the support about 50-50 in favor of the NPA.
And tomorrow?
Tomorrow we're going to see a service that the peasants really like. The guerrillas actually act as the police, the judge, and the executioner.
So they get something for their tax dollar.
For the local criminals, right.
His reign as president, the film serial pertains to the public duties of Marcos. It is the lavish parties and celebrations that are drawing most of the interest. The government has made all of the material available to the media.
Both before and after last month's election campaign, the two legislators are in hiding. Some once private videotapes from the presidential palace have been made public, giving us a rare look at what, to the Marcos family, must certainly have been living the good life. ABC's Jim Laurie is in Manila.
Her last birthday party at Malacañang Palace. Imelda Marcos sings for her friends. Another birthday celebration. Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda throw a palace party for their grandchildren. A rare New Year's Day visit to Malacañang by Cardinal Jaime Sin, one of Marcos' strongest critics. This the last time the two met face to face. And at the palace disco, actor George Hamilton, a frequent guest, danced the night away with Imelda. A look at private lives as captured on the until now private videos of the Marcos family, shot by the palace cameraman. Their extravagant lifestyle being exposed in greater detail than ever before. Today, volunteer tour guides got their first glimpse of the Marcos residence, in awe of Imelda's vast wardrobe, her 2,200 pairs of shoes, the designer dresses, some from Rome, where only days before fleeing, she placed her last $80,000 order. In awe even of Imelda's bathroom, filled with dozens of baskets of expensive soap and perfume.
When you behold all of these gowns and shoes and bags, I don't know how she can wear all of them.
On Friday, Malacañang and its wealth will be open to the public, the first 1,000 visitors to be drawn from the poor and hungry of the city. From the private videos, it appears thoughts of the poor were far from the sheltered world of Malacañang. At one of the last palace parties, Marcos' friends and staff sang, "We Are the World." But the pop anthem for the world's hungry became instead a birthday song for an aging dictator. Jim Laurie, ABC News, Manila.
It took a long time for the dissent in the Philippines to finally topple the Marcos regime. Now that the Philippine revolt has succeeded, political opposition groups in another Asian nation are wondering if their own long struggle will end the same way. ABC's Judd Rose reports from Seoul, South Korea.
Once again, they're rallying round the flag in Asia. And once again, there's a cry for freedom in a land under rigid control. But this is not the Philippines. This is people power, Korean style.
It's just like the Philippines. Why? We have no freedom.
The symbol of the Philippine rebellion has become an inspiration for South Koreans, too, as they try to challenge their government. Today, thousands gathered in support of a petition campaign to change the Constitution and give Koreans the right to vote directly for president, perhaps preventing strongman Chun Doo-hwan from choosing his own successor in 1988.
Defying, in fact, provoking Chun Doo-hwan is exactly what Korean dissidents have in mind. They believe that the more harshly the government responds to events like this, the more momentum the opposition will gain as it takes its campaign to the streets.
On Sunday, students demonstrated in Seoul and police moved in, but there was no confrontation. It was typical of the restraint Chun Doo-hwan has shown his opponents since Marcos fell in Manila.
He was greatly influenced by Philippine Democratic Revolution and American government's criticism, I think.
If America's decision to let Marcos fall worried Chun Doo-hwan, it's no wonder. America is important to Korea and vice versa. Like the Philippines, it's home to several major U.S. bases. And like Marcos, Chun is backed by Washington, although he's unpopular with many Koreans.
This weekend, Cardinal Kim Soo-hwan delivered a pointed sermon, stopping just short of endorsing the opposition petition drive. If that echoed the role of the Philippine church in bringing down Marcos, some say not to take such comparisons on faith alone. Unlike the Philippines, where Marxist rebels are scattered in the mountains, this country faces an entire nation of hostile communists just up the road in North Korea. But the most striking difference is the economy.
The Philippine economy has been declining for some years now, and the Korean economy is still growing very vigorously.
Still, today, thousands took to the streets of Seoul, marching in support of the petition campaign. Predictably, riot police massed along the parade route, and for a time, a clash seemed inevitable. But the moment passed peacefully. Hours after this rally ended, there were violent clashes between students and police. It was another sign that while rebellion isn't imminent, the voice of the people is getting louder and angrier. They sang an old Korean song here today, a song the Filipinos would understand. The song asks, "When will freedom come?" Judd Rose, ABC News.
Contrast to the lives of workers in the impoverished country. Tom Brokaw reports.
The conspicuous consumption of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. We won't give you anything. Actor George Hamilton entertaining the first family of the Philippines, and Maestro Mstislav Rostropovich performing at a cello recital, then thanking his hosts at a lavish buffet. But there was little on the home videotapes to compare with the Marcos family performing its version of We Are the World, a performance at an extravagant costume party for Marcos's daughter Irene on her 30th birthday. Their son, whose nickname is Bong Bong, was one of the stars. And the Marcoses entertained friends in their private two-room disco in Manila's Malacanang Palace. On a more intimate note, the former First Lady serenaded her husband with the song Feelings while he ate pizza.
And that's the National Edition. I'm Jan Tennant. Good night from all of us at Global News, and stay tuned for Sportsline.
Jim Bitterman is in Manila.
At the presidential palace, the people who had changed the presidency pressed up against the fence for a close look. Today was the first official meeting of their new government. President Aquino chose not to convene her new cabinet or live in the grand palace building used by her predecessor, but instead symbolically started her government in a small office building on the palace grounds. It was none too soon to begin. In the 15 days since Marcos fled, Aquino's cabinet members had already begun quibbling among themselves in public, and there has been a growing debate about whether she should declare her government a revolutionary one, bound by no written rules of conduct until a new constitution can be drawn up.
The president named Minister Neftali Gonzalez to head a committee to study whether a revolutionary government should be declared.
In the end, she ducked the question, and she hedged on something she said only last Sunday, that the public could expect an announcement of price decreases after today's meeting. The announcement never came. Only word that another committee would study that question. All in all, the new government seemed off to a modest start. Jim Bitterman, NBC News.
Marcos are now observing a ceasefire. At the same time, President Aquino's cabinet put off a decision today on whether to declare a revolutionary government. More on that now in this report from Jim Bitterman.
It was the first time President Aquino's cabinet had gotten together, and not everyone knew their place. There has already been some public friction between several cabinet members and a great deal of public debate about whether Aquino's government should disregard the constitution drawn up by President Marcos until the new leaders can write a constitution of their own. The question was left undecided, and a committee was formed. The presidential spokesman was asked exactly what the cabinet had been discussing.
All sorts, heavy stuff, light stuff, getting to know you stuff.
For some, that kind of stuff was not good enough. The people who brought the new government to power were already bringing it their complaints and expectations. But Mrs. Aquino has ministers to handle them now. She went from the cabinet meeting to a meeting with her generals, men who also helped to bring her to power and who can help her to keep it. They had wanted to give her an artillery salute, but she symbolically declined.
I was working on land reform or health care, but that wasn't the case. What the NPA does is it gets rid of the criminals. And in this part of the countryside, there's a lot of cattle rustling, there's fish stealing, and the NPA sort of acts as the investigator, the cop, the enforcer, and dispenses its own brand of justice. Mike, what is this place here?
In that lake, we're gonna capture the bad man in this area.
You're gonna capture a bad man on that lake?
Yeah.
What did he do? Why is he bad?
Stealing the fish of the people.
He steals fish from the people?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And what are you gonna do when you catch him?
We're gonna give him a disciplinary action.
Disciplinary action?
Yeah, regarding to his crime.
Uh-uh. And who are these guys here?
The team who...
This is the capturing team?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. What's this? Breakfast?
Yeah.
You're feeding everybody?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody here supports the NPA in this barrio?
Everybody.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Dunning, the alleged thief, was somewhere out on the lake. The local fishermen and the NPA made their plan. How are you going to capture him?
We are going to take him directly to his boat.
You're going to take him off his boat?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And bring him away?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Every fisherman on the lake has his own private fish fattening pen. Dunning had supposedly stolen so many fish that people had to guard the lake 24 hours a day. Mike! Why are there houses on the lake?
The boat is there to protect their fish from the bad man.
They have to guard their fish from this man because he steals them?
Yeah.
After about an hour, the NPA posse began having difficulties.
This one's sinking. Yeah.
Who's that, Mike?
Reinforcement.
Reinforcements? The kids?
Yeah.
The motor stopped. The motor stopped and the boat is sinking.
Yeah. That's why the kid was come here. And they are suggesting to get another motor.
Try to get another boat?
Yeah.
Mike, all the boats are sinking. Their boat's sinking too.
Yeah.
What's so funny? This is like the Keystone Cops.
Yeah.
Mike, what are we getting a new boat?
Yeah.
The new boat didn't solve all the problems. Mike, what's wrong?
We're asking gas.
We're out of gas?
Yeah. Unsuccessful mission, you win some, you lose some.
Win some, you lose some?
Yeah.
The only thing you got was water in your shoes.
Yeah.
He escaped.
That's so exactly.
Not so exactly, but you didn't catch him so exactly either. Mike, what is this? What are you doing?
Plan B again.
Plan B?
Yeah.
Lorenzo, what is Plan B?
We're going to send a letter to the criminal, and we will invite him. It says here that we only want to talk to him. When he comes, then we will prosecute him, execute him.
But Plan B didn't have any more success than Plan A. The guerrillas waited for an hour before going out after their prey.
We warned him many times. If he didn't want to come, then we're going to arrest him in this house.
But aren't you going to give him a second chance?
No, because the people are asking justice. Last night, he stole 5 cages of fish. That's why I think it's the people are fed up.
How many times have you warned him?
We warned him 4 times. 4 times, and a time we asked him to leave, he went back, then he stole. Then the people want justice.
But Dunning was no dummy. He knew what NPA justice meant. His relatives said he had run away. Who's this?
He's the uncle of Dunying, the one we are fetching.
Is Dunying going to come here?
No.
No? Why not?
He was afraid.
Maybe he's hiding now.
Yeah, that's the latest information. He's hiding?
We cannot find him.
The guerrillas headed for the hills to work on another plan.
When we catch him, we will give him justice.
John, were we seeing a political arm in action or a gang of thugs?
Well, I don't know. These guys are very efficient. There used to be 7 members in that particular fish-stealing gang. They've killed 2 of them, 4 have run away, and this was the last fellow left.
I mean, parts of that were very funny. I mean, the boat's sinking, they're running out of gas and everything else, but parts of it pose a serious dilemma here. I mean, what would you have done if they would have finally found this guy? Now, you'd been in on the plan all along, and they were going to kill him.
We were really nervous. I think that our presence there helped tip him off because we were asking the fishermen there, do you want this guy killed? I mean, is it worth getting killed? And there was so much commotion with our cameras there that the family of this particular fellow saw him and warned him and ran away. But we were really perplexed, and we were having great difficulty dealing with the issue that this man was
around the current Constitution and dismantling the autocratic system established during Ferdinand Marcos's 20-year rule. The panel is to report back in a week. CBS News correspondent Bill Redeker in Honolulu has been told that Marcos now is expected to leave Hickam Air Force Base later this evening. Marcos now is expected to take up temporary residence, probably with one of his daughters, in a Honolulu house leased by her.
The chairman of the Philippine Commission seeking the return of the Marcos assets says the documents may provide vital clues to the source of Marcos's fortune.
The wealth here is tremendous, and we hope to be able to restore a sense of normalcy in the dealing between government and people, and to give more substance to the concept that a public office is a public trust.
Marcos has been accused of stealing as much as $10 million from the people of the Philippines. The U.S. trade deficit hit a record.
It is quite clear that evidence is available which unmistakably and by name links President Marcos to holdings in this country and to the Bernstein brothers, who seem to have represented him in the management of his real estate portfolio, at least in New York.
The documents also will be turned over to a Philippine investigating committee. The flight attendants...
He and his wife Imelda also became notorious for their opulent lifestyle. They threw lavish parties for each other at the palace. They threw parties for their grandchildren and parties for all their hangers-on. And they recorded all this partying on their own home videotapes. They sang songs that mocked the pain of the poor, unaware that in the end they wouldn't even have enough time to finish packing. Mrs. Marcos left behind thousands of pairs of shoes and thousands of gowns and dresses. They're all being exposed to public view now since the people took over the palace. Mr. Marcos, his family and friends did not, however, arrive in Hawaii empty-handed. The American plane that carried them to safety also carried more than $1 million in Philippine currency and crate loads of jewelry, art, and deeds to real estate holdings. Those include a mansion on Long Island, you see here, a shopping center in Midtown Manhattan, office buildings, and an elegant townhouse that's filled with artworks that couldn't be packed up in time. It adds up to hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, and the Philippine government wants it back. Bonifacio Giliego is a representative of the Commission on Good Government. It's the Philippine agency that's laying claim to the Marcos holdings with the help of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He's with me here in New York, and joining us in Washington, Representative Stephen Solars, Democrat of New York, who's chairman of the House Subcommittee on Asian and Pacific Affairs, and he is with Steve Bell down in Washington. Congressman, good morning.
Good morning.
And good morning. Nice to have you with us.
Good morning, David.
Good morning. What's the estimated value of all these holdings, at least here in the United States, as far as you can tell?
It would amount to about $1 billion, to include all the assets of not only Mr. Marcos, but his cronies, the so-called Marcos Mafia, whom he enriched in the Philippines during all the 20 years of his power.
How important are the documents that our Customs Department are holding in Hawaii right now, and how important for you to see those?
There are deeds, there are contracts, there are financial reports, and therefore they will establish directly the link between Mr. Marcos and his dummies, nominees, and the offshore corporations, and the people who are acting on his behalf here in the United States.
How satisfied are you with the actions already that are being taken by the United States government, and to what extent is it important for us to do more?
Well, it was quite slow, and I think it was the pressure of public opinion and the findings of people who came from the Philippines, plus the work of Congressman Solers, to whom we are indebted very much, that I think changed somehow the thinking of people in the upper echelons of policy making in the United States. But it came rather slowly, and just like past statements of your president, our people were somehow disappointed.
Congressman, he's expressing some disappointment about the slowness of this process. It seems important, though, that we understand what our government actually promised to Mr. Marcos before he left the Philippines regarding all these holdings. What's your understanding of what promises, if any, were made to Mr. Marcos?
I think we promised Mr. Marcos sanctuary in this country, David, but we clearly didn't promise him immunity from civil proceedings on the part of the government of the Philippines designed to recover his ill-gotten gains in the United States.
Congressman, what are our legal grounds for getting involved in this?
The new government of the Philippines clearly has a right to go into court, certainly in New York, in an effort to reclaim the hidden wealth of the Marcoses in the Empire State on the grounds that the resources which were used to purchase the properties the Marcoses own in the New York area were the result of official misconduct from which they unjustly enriched themselves. In effect, the Marcoses have stolen and swindled hundreds of millions of dollars from the people of the Philippines in order to purchase lucrative commercial properties in the New York area. And the government of the Philippines, if it can establish that, and I believe it will be able to, can then contend that those properties really belong to them.
All right, now the Reagan administration does appear to be ready to turn over these customs documents. Are you satisfied with the administration's conduct in this thing?
I'm very pleased that the administration is cooperating with our committee and with the new government in the Philippines. I've been informed by a senior administration official that these 1,500 documents that the Marcoses brought to Hawaii with them when they fled from Manila will be turned over expeditiously and, in fact, in the next few days to our committee and to the government of the Philippines.
What's your committee's role in this, Congressman? How far are you going to go with this, and how far is it necessary for you to go for there to be a kind of solution that's acceptable to the Filipino people and to our people as well?
We've been conducting this investigation for several months now, David, and essentially we're looking for three things. First, we want to determine whether any of our foreign aid funds to the Philippines have been recycled by the Marcoses in the form of lucrative real estate investments in the United States. Secondly, we want to determine whether any American laws have been violated in the process. And thirdly, we want to help the government of the Philippines identify the extent of the hidden wealth of the Marcoses and their cronies in the United States in order to facilitate their efforts to recover these resources so they can be put to work on behalf of the poor people in Manila rather than remain in the pockets of the Marcoses in Manhattan.
Realistically, how long do you think all this might take, Congressman?
I think it'll take our subcommittee a matter of days to go through these documents and determine to what extent they contain the kind of smoking guns which will enable us to definitively establish what properties the Marcoses own. But I think that the litigation which will be necessary in order for the government of the Philippines to attach these resources is likely to be rather complex and could take much longer.
David, I have a question for both our guests, and that is, how important is all this to the future of U.S.-Philippine relations?
I think it's extremely important that the new government in the Philippines, a democratic government, and the people of that country feel that the United States is cooperating with them in their efforts to recover the not only hundreds of millions, but possibly billions of dollars of resources that the Marcoses and their cronies siphoned off from the Philippines in order to invest in the United States.
Mr. Diego, same question. How important is the relationship between our countries?
It is very important because all throughout the 20 years of Marcos being in power, many people in the Philippines have identified Marcos with the United States. That's why the extreme left has called it the Marcos U.S. dictatorship. And therefore, it is, I think, an act of atonement on the part of the United States and a moral obligation on the part of the United States to enhance the process such that the legal process, the judicial process, which we respect, would not take a long time before final adjudication is made as to who the real owners of these properties are.
With U.S. officials about retrieving the billions Marcos may have spirited out of the Philippines.
Philippine investigators are seeking to recoup up to $10 billion Marcos is believed to have accumulated while in office. This evening on ABC's 2020 at 10 Eastern Time, we'll have a special report on the Marcos fortune.
Marcos is suspected of having plundered from the Philippines has been found in a Swiss bank account. An official of the new Manila government said today that the Philippines will try to recover that money. In Hawaii, meanwhile, Marcos is going to try again tonight to move from Hickam Air Force Base to a rented Honolulu home. But as NBC's George Lewis reports now, no matter where Marcos might move, he is almost certain to be followed by claims against his freedom and his fortune.
There's a lot of activity in an exclusive section of Honolulu amid reports that Ferdinand Marcos would move to this house. Pentagon officials said Marcos was planning to move today. Since yesterday, Secret Service men have been setting up communications and security, and the neighbors have been getting nervous.
Who's going to protect us from people going after him?
This new home will not be a safe haven from the investigations into the Marcos wealth. Jovito Salonga, heading the Philippine government effort to recover the Marcos fortune, is planning to meet with Washington officials in the next few days. They have promised to hand over 1,500 documents seized by U.S. Customs when Marcos arrived in Hawaii. The documents could provide an accounting of the Marcos fortune, which has been estimated as high as $10 billion. Holdings in this country are said to include buildings and estates in New York and New Jersey, land in Texas, banks in California. And Salonga says that's just part of the fortune.
We're not talking only about the United States. What are we talking about? We're talking about Switzerland, Austria, Brazil, and other countries in the world.
Salonga's investigation is not the only one into the Marcos wealth. A federal grand jury is checking the activities of this company, AmWorld, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and whether it was part of a kickback scheme involving U.S. military aid money. There are charges that the former military chief of staff in the Philippines, General Fabian Ver, masterminded the scheme. The Pentagon confirmed that Ver has been subpoenaed in the investigation. It is one of at least 3 grand jury inquiries into kickbacks received by men close to Marcos. Marcos' lawyers have been in and out of court trying to keep his papers secret. Thus far, they have been fighting a losing battle. George Lewis, NBC News, Los Angeles.